Psychological Types by Jung, Chapter 10, General Description of the Types. 1. Introduction. In the following pages I shall attempt a general description of the psychology of the types, starting with the two basic types I have termed introverted and extroverted. This will be followed by a description of those more special types whose peculiarities are due to the fact that the individual adapts and orients herself chiefly by means of her most differentiated function. This former I would call attitude types, distinguished by the direction of their interest or of the movement of libido. The latter I would call functional types. The attitude types, as I have repeatedly emphasized in the preceding chapters, are distinguished by their attitude to the object. The introvert's attitude is an abstracting one at bottom. She is always intent on withdrawing libido from the object, as though she had to prevent the object from gaining power over her. The extrovert, on the contrary, has a positive relation to the object. She affirms its importance to such an extent that her subjective attitude is constantly related to and oriented by the object. The object can never have enough value for her, and its importance must always be increased. The two types are so different and present that such a striking contrast that their existence becomes quite obvious even to the layman, once it has been pointed out. Everyone knows these reversed, inscrutable, rather shy people who form the strongest possible contrast to the open, sociable, jovial, or at least friendly and approachable characters, who are on good terms with everybody, or quarrel with everybody, but always relate to them in some way, and in turn are affected by them. One is naturally inclined at first to regard such differences as mere idiosyncrasies of character peculiar to individuals. But anyone with a thorough knowledge of human nature will soon discover that the contrast is by no means a matter of isolated individual instances, but of typical attitudes which are far more common than one with limited psychological experience would assume. Indeed, as the preceding chapters may have shown, it is a fundamental contrast, sometimes quite clear, sometimes obscured, but always apparent when one is dealing with individuals whose personality is in any way pronounced. Such people are found not merely among the educated, but in all ranks of society, so that our types can be discovered among laborers and peasants no less than among the most highly differentiated members of a community. Sex makes no difference either. One finds that same contrast among women of all classes. Such a widespread distribution could hardly have come about if it were merely a question of conscious and deliberate choice of attitude. In that case, one would surely find one particular attitude in one particular class of people linked together by a common education and background and localized accordingly. But it is not at all so. On the contrary, the types seem to be distributed quite at random. In the same family, one child is introverted, the other extroverted. Since the facts show that this attitude type is a general phenomenon, having an apparently random distribution, it cannot be a matter of conscious judgment or conscious intention, but must be due to some unconscious instinctive cause. As a general psychological phenomenon, therefore, the type antithesis must have a kind of biological foundation. The relationship between subject and object, biologically considered, is always one of adaptation, since every relation between subject and object presupposes the modification of one by the other through reciprocal influence. Adaptation consists in these constant modifications. The typical attitude to the object, therefore, are processes of adaptation. There are in nature two fundamentally different modes of adaptation which ensure the continual existence of the living organism. The one consists in a high rate of fertility, with low powers of defense and short duration of life for the single individual. The other consists in equipping the individual with numerous means of self-preservation, plus a low fertility rate. This biological difference, it seems to me, is not merely analogous to, but the actual foundation of our two psychological modes of adaptation. I must content myself with this broad hint. It is not sufficient to note the peculiar nature of the extrovert constantly urges her to expand and propagate herself in every way, while the tendency of the introvert is to defend herself against all demands from outside, to conserve her energy by withdrawing it from objects, thereby consolidating her own position. Blake's intuition did not err when he described the two classes of men as prolific and devouring. Just as biologically the two modes of adaptation work equally well and are successful in their own way, so too with the types of attitudes. The one achieves its end by a multiplicity of relationships, the other by monopoly. The fact that children often exhibit a typical attitude quite unmistakably even in their earliest years forces us to assume that it cannot be the struggle for existence in the ordinary sense that determines a particular attitude. It might be objected cogently enough that even the infant at the breast has to perform an unconscious act of psychological adaptation, and that the mother's influence leads to specific reactions in the child. This argument, while supported by incontestable evidence, becomes rather flimsy in the face of equally incontestable fact that two children of the same mother may exhibit contrary attitudes at an early age, though no change in the mother's attitude can be demonstrated. Although nothing would induce me to underrate the incalculable importance of parental influence, this familiar experience compels me to conclude that the decisive factor must be looked for in the disposition of the child. Ultimately, it must be the individual disposition which decides whether the child will belong to this or that type, despite the consistency of external conditions. Naturally, I am thinking only of a normal case. Under abnormal conditions, i.e., when the mother's own attitude is extreme, a similar attitude can be forced onto the child, too, thus violating their individual disposition, which might have opted for another type if no abnormal external influences had intervened. As a rule, whenever such a falsification of type takes place as a result of parental influence, the individual becomes neurotic later, and can be cured only by developing the attitude consistent with his nature. As to the individual disposition, I have nothing to say except that there are obviously individuals who have a greater capacity, or to whom it is more congenial to adapt in one way and not in the other. It may well be that psychological causes of which we have no knowledge play a part in this. I do not think it improbable, in view of one's experience, that a reversal of type often proves exceedingly harmful to the psychological well-being of the organism, usually causing acute exhaustion. 2. The extroverted type. In our description of this and the following types, it is necessary, for the sake of clarity, to distinguish between the psychology of consciousness and the psychology of unconsciousness. We shall first describe the psychology of consciousness. A. The general attitude of consciousness. Although it is true that everyone orients herself in accordance with the data supplied by the outside world, we see every day that the data in themselves are only relatively decisive. The fact that it is cold outside prompts one man to put his overcoat, while the other, who wants to get hardened, finds this superfluous. One man admires the latest tenor because everybody else did. Another refuses to, not because he dislikes him, but because in his view the subject of universal admiration is far from having been proved admirable. One man resigns himself to circumstances because experience has shown him that nothing else is possible. Another is convinced that though things have gone in the same way 1,000 times before, the 1,001st time will be different. One holds himself to be oriented by given facts, the other in reserve holds a reserve in view which imposes itself between him and the objective data. Now, when orientation by the object predominates in such a way that decisions and actions are determined not by subjective views, but by objective conditions, we speak of an extroverted attitude. When this is habitual, we speak of an extroverted type. If a man feels, thinks, acts, and actually lives in a way that is directly correlated with the objective conditions and their demands, he is extroverted. His life makes it perfectly clear that it is the object and not the subjective view that plays the determining role in his consciousness. Naturally, he has subjective views too, but their determining value is less than that of the objective conditions. Consequently, he never expects to find any absolute factors in his own inner life, since the only one he knows are outside of himself. Like Epimetheus, his inner life is subordinate to external necessity, though not without a struggle. But it is always the objective determinant that wins in the end. His whole consciousness looks outward, because the essential and decisive determination always comes from outside. But it comes from outside only because that is where he expects it to come. All the peculiarities of his psychology, except those which depend on the primacy of one particular psychological function, or on idiosyncrasies of character, follow from his basic attitude. His interest and attention are directed to objective happenings, particularly those in his immediate environment. Not only people, but things, seize and rivet his attention. Accordingly, they also determine his actions, which are fully explicable on these grounds. The actions of the extrovert are recognized related to external conditions. Insofar as they are not merely reactive to environmental stimuli, they have a character that is always adapted to actual circumstances, and they find sufficient play within the limits of the objective situation. No serious effect is made to transcend these bounds. It is the same with his interest. Objective happenings have an almost inexhaustible fascination for him, so that ordinarily he never looks for anything else. The moral laws governing his actions coincide with the demands of society, that is, with the prevailing moral standpoint. If this were to change, the extrovert's subjective moral guidelines would change accordingly, without this altering his general psychological habits in any way. This strict determination by objective factors does not mean, as one might suppose, a complete let-alone ideal adaptation to the general conditions of life. In the eyes of the extrovert, of course, an adjustment of this kind to the objective situation must seem like complete adaptation, since for him no other criterion exists. From the higher point of view, it by no means follows that the objective situation is, in all circumstances, a normal one. It can quite well be temporarily or locally abnormal. An individual who adjusts herself to it is admittedly conforming to the style of her environment, but together with her whole surroundings, she is in an abnormal situation with respect to the universally valid laws of life. She may indeed thrive in such surroundings, but only up to the point where she and her milieu meet with disaster for transgressing these laws. She will not share the general collapse to exactly the same extent as she was adjusted in the previous situation. Adjustment is not adaptation. Adaptation requires far more than merely going along smoothly with the conditions of the moment. Once again, I would remind the reader of Spitzler's Epimetheus. It requires observation of laws more universal than the immediate conditions of time and place. The very adjustment of the normal extroverted type is her limitation. She owes her normality, on the one hand, to her ability to fit into existing conditions with comparative ease. Her requirements are limited to the objectively possible, for instance, to the career that holds out good prospects at this particular moment. She does what is needed of her, or to what is expected of her, and refrains from all innovations that are not entirely self-evident, or that in any way exceed the expectations of those around her. On the other hand, her normality must also depend essentially on whether she takes account of her subjective needs and requirements, and this is just her weak point. For the tendency of this type is so outer-directed that even the most obvious of all subjective facts, the condition of her own body, receives scant attention. The body is not sufficiently objective or outside so that the satisfaction of elementary needs, which are indispensable to physical well-being, is no longer given due. The body accordingly suffers, to say nothing of the psyche. The extrovert is usually unaware of this latter fact, but it is all the more apparent to her household. She feels her loss of equilibrium only when it announces itself in abnormal body sensations. These she cannot ignore. It is quite natural that she should regard them as concrete and objective, since, with this type of mentality, they cannot be anything else, for her. In others, she at once sees imagination at work. A too extroverted attitude can also become so oblivious of the subject that the latter is sacrificed completely to so-called objective demands, to the demands, for instance, of a continually expanding business, because orders are piling up and profitable opportunities have to be exploited. This is the extrovert's danger. She gets sucked into objects and completely loses herself in them. The resultant functional disorders, nervous or physical, have a compensatory value, as they force him into an involuntary self-reliant. Should the symptoms be functional, their peculiar character may express her psychological situation in symbolic form. For instance, a singer whose fame has risen to dangerous heights that tempt her to expend too much energy suddenly finds she cannot sing high notes because of some nervous inhibition. Or a man of modest beginnings who rapidly reaches a social position of great influence with wide prospects is suddenly afflicted with all symptoms of mountain sickness. Again, a man about to marry a woman of doubtful character whom he adores and vastly overestimates is seized with a nervous spasm of the esophagus and has to restrict himself to 2 cups of milk a day, each of which takes him 3 hours to consume. All visits of the adored are effectively stopped, and he has no choice but to devote himself to the nourishment of his body. Or a man who can no longer carry the weight of the huge business he has built up is afflicted with nervous attacks of thirst and speedily falls victim to hysterical alcoholism. Hysteria is, in my view, by far the most frequent neurosis of the extroverted type. The hallmark of classic hysteria is an exaggerated rapport with persons in the immediate environment and an adjustment of surrounding conditions that amounts to imitation. A constant tendency to make himself interesting and to produce an impression is a basic feature of the hysteric. The corollary of this is his proverbial suggestibility, his proneness to another's influences. Another unmistakable sign of the extroverted hysteric is his effusiveness, which occasionally carries him into the realm of fantasy, so that he is accustomed to the hysterical lie. The hysterical character begins as an exaggeration of the normal attitude. It is then complicated by compensatory reactions from the unconscious, which counteract the exaggerated extraversion by means of physical symptoms that force the libido to introvert. The reaction of the unconscious produces another class of symptoms, having more introverted character, one of the most typical being a morbid intensification of fantasy activity. After this general outline of extroverted attitude, we shall now turn to a description of the modifications which the basic psychological functions undergo as a result of this attitude. B. The attitude of the unconscious. It may seem odd that I should speak of an attitude of the unconscious. As I have repeatedly indicated, I regard the attitude of the unconscious as compensatory to consciousness. According to this view, the unconscious has as good a claim to an attitude as the latter. In the preceding section, I emphasized the tendency to one-sidedness in the extroverted attitude, due to the ascendancy of the object over the course of the psychic events. The extroverted type is constantly tempted to expend herself for the apparent benefit of the object, to assimilate subject to object. As I have discussed in some detail the harmful consequences of an exaggeration of the extroverted attitude, namely the suppression of the subjective factor. It is only to be expected, therefore, that the psychic compensation of the conscious extroverted attitude will lay special weight on the subjective factor, and that we shall find a markedly egocentric tendency in the unconscious. Practical experience proves this to be the case. I do not wish to cite case material at this point, so must refer my readers to the ensuing sections, where I try to present the characteristic attitude of the unconscious in each function type. In this section, we are concerned simply with the compensation of the extroverted attitude in general, so I shall confine myself to describing the attitude of the unconscious in equally good general terms. The attitude of the unconscious has an effective complement in the conscious extroverted attitude. The attitude of the unconscious as an effective complement to the conscious extroverted attitude has a definitely introverting character. It concentrates the libido on the subjective factor, that is, on all those needs and demands that are stifled or repressed by the conscious attitude. As may be gathered from what was said in the previous section, a purely objective orientation does violence to the multitude of subjective impulses, intentions, needs, and desires, and deprives them of the libido that is their natural right. Man is not a machine that can be remodeled for quite other purposes, as occasion demands, in the hope that it will go on functioning as regularly as before, but in quite a different way. He carries his whole history with him. It is his very structure that has written the history of mankind. This historical element in man represents a vital need to which a wise psychic economy must respond. Somehow the past must come alive and participate in the present. Total assimilation to the object will always arouse the protest of the suppressed minority of those elements that belong to the past and have existed from the very beginning. From these general considerations, it is easy to see why the unconscious demands of the extrovert have an essentially primitive, infantile, and egocentric nature. When Freud says that the unconscious can do anything but wish, this is very largely true of the unconscious of the extrovert. His adjustment to the objective situation and his assimilation to the object prevent low-powered subjective impulses from reaching consciousness. These impulses, thoughts, wishes, affects, needs, feelings, etc., take on a regressive character according to the degree of repression. The less they are acknowledged, the more infantile and archaic they become. The conscious attitude robs them of all energy that is readily disposable, only leaving them the energy of which it cannot deprive itself. This residue, which still possesses a potency not to be underestimated, can be described only as primordial instinct. Instinct can never be eradicated in an individual by arbitrary measures. It requires the slow, organic transformation of many generations to effect a radical change. For instinct is the energetic expression of the organism's makeup. Thus, with every repressed impulse, a considerable amount of energy ultimately remains of an instinctive character and preserves its potency despite the deprivation that makes it unconscious. The more complete the conscious attitude of extraversion is, the more infantile and archaic the unconscious attitude will be. The egoism which characterizes the extrovert's unconscious attitude goes far beyond mere childish selfishness. It verges on the ruthless and the brutal. Here we find in full flower the incest wish described by Freud. It goes without saying that these things are entirely unconscious and remain hidden from the layman as long as the extroversion of the conscious attitude is not extreme. But whenever there is exaggerated, the unconscious comes to light in symptomatic form. Its egoism, infantilism, and archaism lose their original compensatory character and appear in more or less open opposition to the conscious attitude. This begins as an absurd exaggeration of conscious standpoint, aiming at a further repression of the unconscious, but usually ends in a reductio ad absurdum of the conscious attitude and hence in catastrophe. The catastrophe may take the form of an objective form, since the objective aims gradually become falsified by the subjective. I remember the case of a printer who, starting as a mere employee, worked his way up over years of hard struggle till at last he became the owner of a flourishing business. The more it expanded, the more it tightened its control on him, until finally it swallowed up all his other interests. This proved his ruin. As an unconscious compensation of his exclusive interest in the business, certain memories of his childhood came to life. As a child, he had taken great delight in painting and drawing. But instead of renewing this capacity for its own sake as a compensating hobby, he channeled it into his business and began wondering how he might embellish his products in an artistic way. Unfortunately, his fantasies materialized. He actually turned out stuff that suited his own primitive and infantile taste, with the result that after very few years, his business went into pieces. He acted in accordance with one of our cultural ideas, which says that any enterprising person has to concentrate everything on the one aim in view. But he went too far, and merely fell a victim to the power of his infantile demands. The catastrophe can, however, also be subjective and take the form of a nervous breakdown. This invariably happens when the influence of the unconscious finally paralyzes all conscious action. The demands of the unconscious then force themselves imperiously on consciousness and bring about a disastrous split which shows itself in one of two ways. Either the subject no longer knows what she really wants, and nothing interests her, or she wants too much at once and has too many interests, but in impossible things. The suppression of infantile and primitive demands for cultural reasons easily leads to a neurosis or to the abuse of narcotics such as alcohol, morphine, and cocaine. In more extreme cases, the split ends in suicide. It is an outstanding peculiarity of unconscious impulses that, when deprived of energy or by lack of conscious recognition, they take on a destructive character, and this happens as soon as they cease to be compensatory. Their compensatory function ceases as soon as they reach a depth corresponding to a cultural level absolutely incomparable with our own. From this moment, the unconscious impulses form a block in every way opposed to the conscious attitude, and its very existence leads to open conflict. Generally speaking, the compensating attitude of the unconscious finds expression in the maintenance of the psychic equilibrium. A normal extroverted attitude does not, of course, mean that the individual invariably behaves in accordance with the extroverted schema. Even in the same individual, many psychological processes may be observed that involve the mechanism of introversion. We call a mode of behavior extroverted only when the mechanism of extraversion predominates. In these cases, the most differentiated function is always employed in an extroverted way, whereas the inferior functions are introverted. In other words, the superior function is the most conscious one and completely under conscious control, whereas the less differentiated functions are in part unconscious and far less under the control of consciousness. The superior function is always an expression of the conscious personality, of its aims, will, and general performance, whereas the less differentiated function fall into the category of things that simply happen to one. These things need not be mere slips of the tongue or pen, or take such oversights. They can equally well be half or three-quarters intended, for the less differentiated functions also possess a slight degree of consciousness. A classical example of this is the extroverted feeling type, who enjoys an excellent feeling of rapport with people around her, yet occasionally happens to express opinions of unsurpassable tactlessness. These opinions, springing from her inferior and half-conscious thinking, which, being only partly under her control and sufficiently related to the object, can be quite ruthless in its effect. The less differentiated function of the extrovert always shows a highly subjective coloring, with pronounced egocentricity and personal bias, thus revealing their close connection with the unconscious. The unconscious is continually coming to light through them. It should not be imagined that the unconscious lies permanently buried under so many overlaying strata that it can only be uncovered, so to speak, by a laborious process of evacuation. On the contrary, there is a constant influx of unconscious contents into the conscious psychological process, to such a degree that at times it is hard for the observer to decide which character traits belong to the conscious and which to the unconscious personality. This difficulty is met with mainly in people who are given to express themselves more profusely than others. Naturally, it also depends very largely on the attitude of the observer, whether she seizes hold of the conscious or the unconscious character of the personality. Generally speaking, a judging observer will tend to seize on the conscious character, while a perceptive observer will be more influenced by the unconscious character, since judgment is chiefly concerned with the conscious motivation of the psychic process, while perception registers the process itself. But, insofar as we apply judgment and perception in equal measure, it may easily happen that a personality appears to us as both introverted and extroverted, so that we cannot decide at first which attitude the superior function belongs. In such cases, only a thorough analysis of the qualities of each function can help us to form a valid judgment. We must observe which function is completely under conscious control, and which function have a haphazard and spontaneous character. The former is always more highly differentiated, and the latter, which also possesses infantile and primitive than the latter, which also possesses infantile and primitive traits. Occasionally, the superior function gives the impression of normality, while the others have something abnormal or pathological about them. C. The peculiarities of the basic psychological functions in the extroverted attitude, thinking. As a consequence of the general attitude of extroversion, thinking is oriented by the object and objective data. This gives rise to noticeable peculiarity. Thinking in general is fed on the one hand from subjective and in the last resort unconscious sources, and on the other hand from objective data transmitted by sense perception. Extroverted thinking is conditioned in a large measure by the latter than the former. Judgment always presupposes a criterion. For the extroverted judgment, the criterion supplied by the external condition is a valid and determining one, no matter whether it be represented directly by an objective perceptible fact or by an objective idea. For an objective idea is equally determined by external data or borrowed from outside, even when it is subjectively sanctioned. Extroverted thinking, therefore, need not necessarily be purely concrete thinking. It can be just as well a purely ideal thinking, if, for instance, it can be shown that the idea it operates with are largely borrowed from outside, i.e., having been transmitted by tradition and education. So, in judging whether a particular thinking is extroverted or not, we must first ask why. By what criterion does it judge? Does it come from outside, or is its origin subjective? The further criterion is the direction the thinking takes in drawing conclusions, whether it is principally directed outwards or not. It is no proof of its extroverted nature that it is preoccupied with concrete objects, since my thinking may be preoccupied with a concrete object, either because I am abstracting my thought from it, or because I am concretizing my thought through it. Even when my thinking is preoccupied with concrete things, and could be described as extroverted to that extent, the direction of it will still remains an essential characteristic and an open question, namely, whether or not in its further course it leads back again to objective data, external facts, or generally accepted ideas. So far as the practical thinking of the businessman, the technician, or the scientific investigator is concerned, its outer directedness is obvious enough. But in the case of the philosopher, it remains open to doubt whether her thinking is directed to ideas. We then have to inquire whether these ideas are simply abstractions from objective experience, in which case they would represent higher collective concepts comprising a sum of objective facts, or whether, if they are clearly not abstractions from immediate experience, they may not be derived from traditional or borrowed from intellectual atmosphere of the time. In the latter case, they fall into the category of objective data, and accordingly this thinking should be called extroverted. Although I do not propose to discuss the nature of introverted thinking at this point, reserving it for the later section, it is essential that I should say a few words about it before proceeding further. For if one reflects on what I have just said about extroverted thinking, one might easily conclude that this covers everything that is ordinarily understood as thinking. A thinking that is directed neither to objective facts nor to general ideas, one might argue scarcely deserves the name thinking at all. I am fully aware that our age and its most eminent representatives know and acknowledge only the extroverted type of thinking. This is largely because all the thinking that appears visibly on the surface in the form of science or philosophy, or even art, either derives directly from objects or else flows into general ideas. For both these reasons it appears essentially understandable, even though it may not always be self-evident, and it is therefore regarded as valid. In this sense, it might be said that the extroverted intellect, oriented by objective data, is actually the only one that is recognized. But now I come to the question of the introverted intellect. There also exists an entirely different kind of thinking, to which the term thinking can hardly be denied. It is the kind that is oriented neither by immediate experience of objects nor by traditional ideas. I reach this other thinking in the following manner. When my thoughts are preoccupied with a concrete idea or a general idea, in such a way that the course of my thinking eventually leads me back to my starting point, this intellectual process is not the only psychic process that is going on in me. I will disregard all those sensations and feelings which become noticeable as a more or less disturbing accompaniment to my train of thought, and will merely point out that this very thinking process which starts from the objects and returns to the objects also stands in constant relation to the subject. This relationship is a sine qua non, without which no thinking process whatever could take place. Even though my thinking process is directed as far as possible to objective data, it is still my subjective process, and it can neither avoid nor dispense with this admixture of subjectivity. Struggle as I may to give an objective orientation to my train of thought, I cannot shut out all the parallel subjective processes in its running accompaniment without extinguishing the very spark of life from my thought. This parallel process has a natural and hardly avoidable tendency to subjectify the objective data and assimilate them to the subject. Now, when the main accent lies on the subjective process, that other kind of thinking arises which is opposed to extroverted thinking, namely that purely subjective orientation, which I call introverted. This thinking is neither determined by objective data nor directed to them. It is a thinking that starts from the subject and is directed to subjective ideas or subjective facts. I do not wish to enter more fully into this kind of thinking here. I have merely established its existence as the necessary complement of extroverted thinking and brought it into clearer focus. Extroverted thinking, then, comes into existence only when the objective orientation predominates. This fact does nothing to alter the logic of thinking. It merely constitutes that difference between thinkers which James considers a matter of temperament. Orientation to the object, as already explained, makes no essential change in the thinking function. Only its appearance is altered. It has the appearance of being captivated by the object, as though without the external orientation it simply could not exist. It almost seems as though it were a mere sequel of external facts, or as though it could reach its highest point only when flowing into some general idea. It seems to be constantly affected by the object's data and to draw conclusions only with their consent. Hence it gives one the impression of a certain lack of freedom, of occasional short-sightedness, in spite of all its adroitness with the areas circumscribed by the object. What I am describing is simply the impression this sort of thinking makes on the observer, who must herself have a different standpoint, otherwise it would be impossible for her to observe the phenomena of extroverted thinking at all. But because of her different standpoint, she sees only its outward aspect, not its essence, whereas the thinker herself can apprehend its essence, but not its outward aspect. Judging by appearances can never do justice to that essence of thinking, hence the verdict is, in most cases, depreciatory. In its essence, this thinking is no less fruitful and creative than introverted thinking. It merely serves other ends. The difference becomes quite palpable when extroverted thinking appropriates material that is a special province of introverted thinking, when, for instance, a subjective conviction is explained analytically in terms of objective data, or as being derived from objective ideas. For our scientific consciousness, however, the difference becomes even more obvious when introverted thinking attempts to bring objective data into connections not warranted by the objects. In other words, to subordinate them to a subjective idea. Each type of thinking senses the other as an encroachment on its own province, and hence a sort of shadow effect is produced, each revealing to the other its least favorable aspect. Introverted thinking then appears as something quite arbitrary, while extroverted thinking seems dull and banal. Thus, the two orientations are increasingly at war. One might think it easy enough to put an end to this conflict by making a clear distinction between objective and subjective data. Unfortunately, this is impossible, though not a few have attempted it. And even if it were possible, it would be a disastrous proceeding, since in themselves both orientations are one-sided and of limited validity, so that each needs the influence of the other. When objective data predominate over thinking to any great extent, thinking is sterilized, becoming a mere appendage of the object and no longer capable of abstracting itself into an independent concept. It is then reduced to a kind of afterthought, by which I do not mean reflection, but merely imitative thinking, which affirms nothing beyond what is visibly and immediately present in the objective data in the first place. This thinking naturally leads directly back to the object, but never beyond it, not even to a linking of experience with an objective idea. Conversely, when it has an idea for an object, it is quite unable to experience its practical, individual value, but remains stuck in a more or less tautological position. The materialistic mentality is an instructive example of this. When extroverted thinking is subordinated to objective data as a result of overdetermination by the object, it engrosses itself entirely in the individual experience and accumulates a mass of undigested empirical material. The oppressive weight of individual experiences having little or no connection with one another produces a disassociation of thought, which usually requires psychological compensation. This must consist in some simple general idea that gives coherence to the distorted whole, or at least affords the possibility of such. Ideas like matter or energy serve this purpose. But when the thinking depends primarily not on objective data, but on some second-hand idea, the very poverty of this thinking is compensated by an all the more impressive accumulation of facts congregating round a narrow and sterile point of view, with the result that many valuable and meaningful aspects are completely lost sight of. Many of the allegedly scientific outpourings of our own day owe their existence to this wrong orientation. The extroverted thinking type. It is a fact of experience that the basic psychological functions seldom or never all have the same strength or degree of development in the same individual. As a rule, one or the other functions predominates in both strength and development. When thinking holds prior place among the psychological functions, i.e., when the life of an individual is mainly governed by reflective thinking so that every important action proceeds, or is intended to proceed, from intellectually considered motives, we may fairly call this type a thinking type. Such a type may be either introverted or extroverted. We will first discuss an extroverted thinking type. This type will, by definition, be a person whose constant endeavor, insofar, of course, as she is a pure type, is to make all her activities dependent on intellectual conclusions, which, in the last resort, are always oriented by objective data, whether those be external facts or generally accepted ideas. This type of person elevates objective reality, or an objectively oriented intellectual formula, into the ruling principle not only for herself, but for her whole environment. By this formula good and evil are measured, and beauty and ugliness are determined. Everything that agrees with this formula is right, everything that contradicts it is wrong, and anything that passes by it indifferently is merely incidental. Because this formula seems to embody the entire meaning of life, it is made into a universal law, which must be put into effect everywhere all the time, both individually and collectively. Just as the extroverted thinking type subordinates herself to her formula, so, for their own good, everybody around her must obey it too, for whoever refuses to obey it is wrong. He is resisting the universal law, and is therefore unreasonable, immoral, and without a conscience. Her moral code forbids her to tolerate exceptions. Her ideal must under all circumstances be realized, for in her eyes it is the purest conceivable formulation of objective reality, and therefore must also be a universally valid truth, quite indispensable from the salvation of mankind. This is not from any great love for her neighbor, but from the higher standpoint of justice and truth. Anything in her own nature that appears to invalidate this formula is mere imperfection, an accidental failure, something to be eliminated on the next occasion, or, in the event of further failure, clearly pathological. If tolerance for the sick, the suffering, or the abnormal should chance to be an ingredient of the formula, special provisions will be made for humane societies, hospitals, prisons, and missions, or at least extensive plans will be drawn up. Generally, the motive of justice and truth is not sufficient to endure to ensure the actual execution of such projects. For this, real Christian charity is needed, and this has more to do with feelings than with any intellectual formula. Oughts and musts bulk large in this program. If the formula is broad enough, this type may play an useful role in social life as a reformer or public prosecutor or a purifier of conscience, or as a propagator of important innovations. But the more rigid the formula, the more she develops into a martinet, a quibbler, and a prig, who would like to force herself and others into one mold. Here we have the two extremes between which the majority of these types move. In accordance with the nature of extroverted attitude, the influence and activities of these personalities are the more favorable and beneficial the further from the center their radius extends. Their best aspect is to be found at the periphery of their sphere of influence. The deeper we penetrate into their own power province, the more we feel the unfavorable aspects of their tyranny. A quite different life pulse at the periphery, where the truth of the formula can be felt as a valuable adjunct to the rest. But the closer we come to the center of power, where the formula operates, the more life withers away from everything that does not conform to its dictates. Usually it is the nearest relatives who have to taste the unpleasant consequences of the extroverted formula, since they are the first to receive its relentless benefits. But in the end, it is the subject herself who suffers most, and this brings us to the reverse side of the psychology of this type. The fact that an intellectual formula never has been and never will be devised which could embrace and express the manifold possibilities of life must lead to the inhibition or exclusion of other activities and ways of living that are just as important. In the first place, all those activities that are dependent on feeling will become repressed in such a type. For instance, aesthetic activities, taste, artistic sense, cultivation of friends, etc. Irrational phenomena such as religious experiences, passions, and such like are often repressed to the point of complete unconsciousness. Doubtless there are exceptional people who are able to sacrifice their entire life to a particular formula, but for most of us such exclusiveness is impossible in the long run. Sooner or later, depending on our outer circumstances and inner disposition, the potentialities repressed by the intellectual attitude will make themselves indirectly felt by disturbing the conscious conduct of life. When the disturbance reaches a definite point, we speak of a neurosis. In most cases, it does not go far, because the individual instinctively allows himself extenuating modifications of his formula in a suitably rationalistic guise, thus creating a safety valve. The relative or total unconsciousness of the tendencies and functions excluded by the conscious attitude keep them in an undeveloped state. In comparison with the conscious function, they are inferior. To the extent that they are unconscious, they become merged with the rest of the unconscious contents and acquire a bizarre character. To the extent that they are conscious, they play only a secondary role, though one of considerable importance for the overall psychological picture. The first function to be affected by the conscious inhibition is feeling, since it is the most opposed to the rigid intellectual formula and is therefore repressed with the most intensity. No function can be entirely eliminated. It can only be greatly distorted. Insofar as feeling is compliant and lets itself be subordinated, it has to support the conscious attitude and adapt to its aims. But this is possible only up to a point. Part of it remains refractory and has to be repressed. If the repression is successful, the subliminal feeling then functions in a way that is opposed to the conscious aims, even producing effects whose cause is a complete enigma to the individual. For example, the conscious altruism of this type, which is often quite extraordinary, may be thwarted by a secret self-seeking which gives a selfish twist to actions that in themselves are disinterested. Purely ethical intentions may lead him into critical situations which sometimes have more than a semblance of being the outcome of motives far from ethical. There are guardians of public morals who suddenly find themselves in compromising situations, or rescue workers who are themselves in dire need of rescue. Their desire to save others leads them to employ means which are calculated to bring about the very thing they wish to avoid. They are extroverted idealists, so consumed by their desire for the salvation of mankind that they will not shrink from any lie or trickery in pursuit of their ideal. In science, there are not a few painful examples of highly respected investigators who are so convinced of the truth and general validity of a formula that they are not so scrupled to falsify evidence in its favor. Their sanction is, the end justifies the means. Only an inferior feeling function, operating unconsciously and in secret, could seduce otherwise reputable men into such aberrations. The inferiority of feeling in this type also manifests itself in other ways. In keeping with the objective formula, the conscious attitude becomes more or less impersonal, often to such a degree that personal interests suffer. If the attitude is extreme, all personal considerations are lost sight of, even those affecting the subject's own person. His health is neglected, his social position deteriorates, the most vital interests of his family, health, finances, morals, are violated for the sake of the ideal. Personal sympathy with others must in any case suffer unless they too happen to espouse the same ideal. Often the closest members of his family, his own children, know such a father only as a cruel tyrant, while the outside world resounds with the fame of his humanity. Because of the highly impersonal character of the conscious attitude, the unconscious feelings are extremely personal and oversensitive, giving rise to secret prejudices, a readiness, for instance, to micro-construe any opposition to his formula as a personal ill will, or a constant tendency to make negative assumptions about other people in order to invalidate their arguments in advance, in defense, naturally, of his own touchiness. Unconscious sensitivity makes him sharp-tongued, acrimonious, aggressive. Insinuations multiply. His feelings have a sultry and resentful character, always a mark of inferior function. Magnanimous as he may be in sacrificing himself to his intellectual goal, his feelings are petty, mistrustful, crotchety, and conservative. Anything new that is not already contained in his formula is seen through a veil of unconscious hatred and condemned accordingly. As late as the middle of the last century, a certain doctor, famed for his humanitarianism, threatened to dismiss an assistant for daring to use a thermometer, because the formula decreed that temperature must be taken by the pulse. The more the feelings are repressed, the more deleterious is their secret influence on thinking that is otherwise beyond reproach. The intellectual formula, which, because of its intrinsic value, might be justifiably claimed general recognition, undergoes a characteristic alteration as a result of this unconscious personal sensitiveness. It becomes rigidly dogmatic. The self-assertion of personality is transformed to this formula. Truth is no longer allowed to speak for itself. It is identified with the subject and treated like a sensitive darling, whom the evil-minded critic has wronged. The critic is demolished, if possible with personal invective, and no argument is too gross to be used against him. The truth must be trotted out until finally it begins to dawn on the public that there is not so much of a question of truth as of personal begetter. The dogmatism of the intellectual formula sometimes undergoes further characteristic alterations, due not so much to the unconscious admixture of repressed personal feelings as to the contamination with other unconscious factors that have become fused with them. Another reason itself tells us that every intellectual formula can never be anything more than a partial truth and can never claim general validity. In practice, the formula gains such an ascendancy until all other possible standpoints are thrust into the background. It usurps the place of all more general, less definite, more moderate, and therefore more truthful views of life. It even supplants that general view of life we call religion. Thus the formula becomes a religion, although in essentials it has not the slightest connection with anything religious. At the same time, it assumes the essentially religious quality of absoluteness. It becomes an intellectual superstition. But now all the psychological tendencies it has repressed build up with a counterposition in the unconscious and give rise to paroxysms of doubt. The more it tries to fend off the doubt, the more fanatical the conscious attitude becomes, for fanaticism is nothing but overcompensated doubt. This development ultimately leads to an exaggerated defense of the conscious position, and to the formulation of the conscious position if in the unconscious absolutely opposed to it. For instance, conscious rationalism is opposed by an extreme irrationality, and a scientific attitude by one that is archaic and superstitious. This explains those bigoted and ridiculous views well known in the history of science, which have proved stumbling blocks to many eminent investigator. Frequently the unconscious counterposition is embodied in a woman. In my experience, this type is chiefly found among men, since in general, thinking tends to more often be a dominant function in men than in women. When thinking dominates in a woman, it is usually associated with a predominantly intuitive cast of mind. The thinking of the extroverted type is positive, i.e., productive. It leads to the discovery of new facts or to general conceptions based on disparate empirical matters. It is usually synthetic, too. Even when it analyzes, it construes, because it is always advancing beyond the analysis to a new combination, to a further conception which reunites the analyzed material in a different way or adds something to it. One could call this kind of judgment predicative. A characteristic feature, at any rate, is that it is never truly absolutely depreciative or destructive, since it always substitutes a fresh value for the one destroys. This is because the thinking of this type is the main channel for which his vital energy flows. The steady flow of life manifests itself in his thinking, so that his thought has a progressive creative quality. It is not stagnant or regressive. But it can become so that it fails to retain prior place in his consciousness. In that case, it loses the quality of a positive vital activity. It follows in the wake of other functions and becomes Epimethean, plagued by afterthoughts, contenting itself with constant broodings on things of the past and gone, chewing them over in an effort to analyze and digest them. Since the creative element is now lodged in another function, thinking no longer progresses, it stagnates. Judgment takes on a distinctive quality of inherence. It confines itself entirely to the range of the given material, nowhere overstepping it. It is satisfied with more or less abstract statements which do not impart any value to the material that is already inherent in it. Such judgments are always oriented to the subject, and they affirm nothing more about an experience than its objective and intrinsic meaning. We may easily observe this type of thinking in people who cannot refrain from tacking on to an impression or experience some rational and doubtless very valid remark which in no way ventures beyond the charmed circle of the objective datum. At bottom such a remark merely says, "I have understood it because afterwards I can think it." And there the matter ends. At best such a judgment amounts to no more than putting the experience in an objective setting where it quite obviously belonged in the first place. But whenever a function other than thinking predominates in consciousness in any marked degree, thinking, so far as it is conscious at all and not directly dependent on the dominant function, assumes a negative character. If it is subordinated to the dominant function, it may actually wear a positive aspect, but closer scrutiny will show that it simply mimics the dominant function, supporting it with arguments that clearly contradict the laws of logic proper to thinking. This kind of thinking is of no interest for our present discussion. Our concern is rather with the nature of thinking, which cannot subordinate itself to another function, but remains true to its own principle. To observe and investigate this thinking is not easy, because it is more or less constantly repressed by the conscious attitude. Hence, in the majority of cases, it must first be retrieved from the background of consciousness, unless it should come to the surface accidentally in some unguarded moment. As a rule, it has to be enticed with some kind of question. Now, what do you really think? Or, what is your private view of the matter? Or, perhaps, one may have to use a little cunning, framing the question something like this: what do you imagine, then, that I really think about it? One should adopt this device when the real thinking is unconscious and therefore projected. The thinking that is enticed to the surface in this way has characteristic qualities, and it was these I had in mind when I described it as negative. Its habitual mode is best expressed by the two words "nothing but." Goethe personified this thinking in the figure of Mephistopheles, Above all, it shows a distinct tendency to trace the object of its judgment back to some banality or other, thus stripping it of any significance in its own right. The trick is to make it appear dependent on something quite commonplace. Whenever a conflict arises between two men over something apparently objective and impersonal, negative thinking mutters, "Cherchez la femme." Whenever someone defends or advocates a cause, negative thinking never asks about its importance, but simply, what does he get out of it? The dictum ascribes to Scott, "Der Mensch ist, was isst." Man is what he eats, or rendered more freely, you eat what you eat you are. Likewise comes under this heading, as do many other aphorisms I need not quote here. The destructive quality of this thinking, as well as its limited usefulness on occasion, does not need stressing. But there is still another form of negative thinking, which at first glance might not be recognized as such, but it is Theosophical thinking, which today is rapidly spreading in all parts of the world, presumably in reaction to the materialism of the recent past. Theosophical thinking has an air that is not in the least reductive, since it exalts everything to a transcendental and world-embracing idea. A dream, for instance, is no longer just a dream, but an experience on another plane. The hitherto inexplicable fact of telepathy is very simply explained as vibrations passing from one person to another. An ordinary nervous complaint is explained by the fact that something has collided with an astral body. Certain ethnological peculiarities of the dwellers on the Atlantic seaboard are easily accounted for by the submergence of Atlantis, and so on. We have only to open a theosophical book to be overwhelmed by the realization that everything is already explained, but that spiritual science has left no enigmas unsolved. But, at bottom, this kind of thinking is just as negative as materialistic thinking. When the latter regards psychology as chemical changes in the ganglia, or as the excretion and retention of cell pseudopodia, or as an internal secretion, this is just as much a suppression as theosophy. The only difference is that materialism reduces everything to physiology, whereas theosophy reduces everything to Indian metaphysics. When a dream is tracked back to an overlooked stomach, this is no explanation of the dream. And when we explain telepathy by vibrations, we have just said just as little, for what are vibrations? Not only are both methods of explanations futile, they are actually destructive, because by diverting interest away from the main issue, in one case the stomach and in other imaginary vibrations, they hamper any serious investigation of the problem by a bogus explanation. Either kind of thinking is sterile and sterilizing. Its negative quality is due to the fact that it is so incredibly cheap, impoverished, and lacking in creative energy. It is a thinking taken in tow by other functions. Feeling. Feeling in the extroverted attitude is likewise oriented by objective data, the object being the indispensable determinant of the quality of feeling. The extrovert's feeling is always in harmony with objective values. For anyone who has known feeling only as something subjective, the nature of extroverted feeling will be difficult to grasp, because it has detached itself as much as possible from the subjective factor and subordinated itself entirely to the influence of the object. Even when it appears not to be qualified by a concrete object, it is none the less under the spell of traditional or generally accepted values of some kind. I may feel moved, for instance, to say that something is beautiful or good, not because I find it beautiful or good for my own subjective feeling about it, because it is fitting and politic to call it so, since a contrary judgment would upset the general feeling situation. A feeling judgment of this kind is not by any means a pretense or a lie, it is simply an act of adjustment. A painting, for instance, is called beautiful because a painting hung in a drawing room and bearing a well-known signature is generally assumed to be beautiful, or because it is called hideous would presumably offend the family of its fortunate possessor, or because the visitor wants to create a pleasant feeling atmosphere, for which purpose everything must be felt as agreeable. These feelings are governed by an objective criterion. As such, they are genuine, and represent the feeling function as a whole. In precisely the same way, an extroverted thinking strives to rid itself of subjective influences. Extroverted feeling has to undergo a process of differentiation before it is finally denuded of every subjective trimming. The valuations resulting from the act of feeling either correspond directly with the objective values or accord with traditional and generally accepted standards. This kind of feeling is very largely responsible for the fact that so many people flock to the theater or to concerts or go to church and do so moreover with their feelings correctly adjusted. Fashion, too, owes their whole existence to it, and what is far more valuable, the positive support of social, philanthropic, and other cultural institutions. In these matters, extroverted feeling proves itself a creative factor. Without it, a harmonious social life would be impossible. To that extent, extroverted feeling is just as beneficial and sweetly reasonable in its effect as extroverted thinking. But these salutary effects are lost as soon as the object gains ascendancy. The force of extroverted feeling then pulls the personality into the object. The object assimilates him, whereupon the personal quality of the feeling, which constitutes its chief charm, disappears. It becomes cold, unfeeling, untrustworthy. It has ulterior motives, or at least makes an impartial observer suspect them. It no longer makes that agreeable and refreshing impression which invariably accompanies genuine feeling. Instead, one suspects a pose, or that the person is acting, even though he may be quite unconscious of any egocentric motives. Over-extroverted feeling may satisfy aesthetic expectations, but it does not speak to the heart. It appeals merely to the senses, or worse still, only to reason. It can provide the aesthetic padding for a situation, but there it stops, and beyond that its effect is nil. It has become sterile. If this process goes any further, a curiously contradictory disassociation of feelings results. Everything becomes an object of feeling valuations, and innumerable relationships are entered into, which are all at variance with each other. As this situation would become quite impossible if the subject received anything like due emphasis, even the last vestiges of a real personal standpoint are suppressed. The subject becomes so enmeshed in the network of individual feelings processes that to the observer it seems as though they were merely a feeling process and no longer a subject of feeling. Feeling in this state has lost all human warmth. It gives the impression of being put on, fickle, unreliable, and in the worst case hysterical. The extroverted feeling type. As feeling is undeniably a more obvious characteristic of feminine psychology than thinking, the most pronounced feeling types are to be found mainly among women. When extroverted feeling predominates, we speak of an extroverted feeling type. Examples of this type, then, I can call to mind are, almost without exception, women. The woman of this type follows her feeling as a guide throughout life. As a result of upbringing, her feeling has developed into an adjusted function subject to conscious control. Except in extreme cases, her feeling has a personal quality, even though she may have repressed the subjective factor to a large extent. Her personality appears adjusted in relation to external conditions. Her feelings harmonize with objective situations and general values. This is seen nowhere more clearly than in her love choices. The suitable man is loved, and no one else. He is suitable not because he appeals to her hidden subjective nature, about which she usually knows nothing, but because he comes up to all reasonable expectations in the matter of age, position, income, size, and respectability in his family, etc. One could easily reject such a picture as ironical and cynical, but I am fully convinced that the love feelings of this type of woman is in perfect accord with her choice. It is genuine and not just shrewd. There are countless reasonable marriages of this kind, and they are by no means the worst. These women are good companions and excellent mothers so long as the husbands and children are blessed with conventional psychic constitution. But no one can feel correctly, only when feeling is not disturbed by anything else. Nothing disturbs feeling so much as thinking. It is therefore understandable that in this type thinking will be kept in abeyance as much as possible. This does not mean that the woman does not think at all. On the contrary, she may think a great deal, and very cleverly, but her thinking is never sui generis. It is an Epimethean appendage to her feeling. What she cannot feel, she cannot consciously think. But I can't think what I don't feel, such a type said to me once in indignant tones. As far as her feelings allows, she can think very well, but every conclusion, however logical, that might lead to a disturbance of feeling is rejected at the outset. It is simply not thought. Thus everything that fits with the objective values is good and is loved, and everything else seems to her to exist in a world apart. But a change comes over the picture when the importance of the object reaches at a still higher level. As already explained, the subject then becomes so assimilated to the object that the object of feeling is completely engulfed. Feeling loses its personal quality and becomes feeling for its own sake. The personality seems wholly dissolved in the feeling of the moment. But since actual life is a constant succession of situations that evoke different and even contradictory feelings, the personality gets split into as many different feeling states. At one moment one is this, at another something is quite different to all appearances, for in reality such a multiple personality is impossible. The basis of the ego always remains the same, and consequently finds itself at odds with the changing feeling states. To the observer, therefore, the display of feelings no longer appears as a personal expression of the subject, but as an alteration of the ego, a mood, in other words. Depending on the degree of disassociation between the ego and the momentary state of feeling, signs of self-disunity will become clearly apparent, because the originally compensatory attitude of the unconscious has turned into open opposition. This shows itself first of all in extravagant displays of feeling, gushing talk, loud expositions, which ring hollow. The lady doth protest too much. It is at once apparent that some kind of resistance is being overcompensated, and one begins to wonder whether those demonstrating might not turn out quite different. I wonder whether those demonstrations might not turn out quite different, and a little later they do. Only a very slight alteration in the situation is needed to call forth at once just the opposite pronouncement on the self-same object. As a result of these experiences, the observer is unable to take either pronouncement seriously. She begins to reserve judgment, but since, for this time, it is of the highest importance to establish an intense feeling of rapport with the environment, redoubled efforts are now required to overcome this reserve. Thus, in the manner of a vicious circle, the situation goes from bad to worse. The stronger the feeling relation to the object, the more the unconscious opposition comes to the surface. We have already seen that the extroverted feeling type suppresses thinking most of all because this is the function most liable to disturb feeling. For the same reason, thinking totally shuts out feeling if ever it wants to reach any kind of pure results, for nothing is more liable to prejudice and falsify thinking than feeling values. But, as I have said, though the thinking of an extroverted feeling type is repressed as an independent function, the repression is not complete. It is repressed only so far as its inextricable logic drives it to conclusions that are incomprehensible with feeling. It is suffered to extent as a servant of feeling, or rather as its slave. Its backbone is broken. It may not operate on its own account, in accordance with its own laws, but since logic nevertheless exists and enforces its inextricable conclusions, this must take place somewhere, and it takes place outside consciousness, namely in the unconscious. Accordingly, the unconscious of this type contains first and foremost a peculiar kind of thinking, a thinking that is infantile, archaic, and negative. So long as the conscious feeling preserves its personal quality, or, to put it another way, so long as the personality is not swallowed up in the successive states of feeling, this unconscious thinking remains compensatory. But as soon as the personality is disassociated and dissolves into a succession of contradictory feeling states, the identity of the ego is lost and the subject lapses into unconscious. When this happens, it gets associated with the unconscious thinking process and occasionally helps them to the surface. The stronger the conscious feeling is, the more egoless it becomes, the stronger grows the unconscious opposition. The unconscious thoughts gravitate round just the most valuable objects and mercilessly strip them of their value. The nothing but type of thinking comes into its own here, since it effectively depotentiates all feelings that are bound to the object. The unconscious thinking reaches the surface in the form of obsessive ideas, which are invariably of a negative and depreciatory character. Women of this type have moments when the most hideous thoughts fasten on the very objects most valued by their feelings. Their negative thinking utilizes every infantile prejudice or comprehension comparison for the deliberate purpose of casting aspirations on the feelings of value, and musters every primitive instinct in an attempt to come out with nothing but interpretations. It need hardly be remarked that this procedure also mobilizes the collective unconscious and activates its store of primordial images, thus bringing with it the possibility of a regeneration of attitude on a different basis. Hysteria, with the characteristic infantile sexuality of its unconscious world of ideas, is the principal form of neurosis of this type. Summary of the extroverted rational types. I call the two preceding types rational or judging types because they are characterized by the supremacy of reasoning and judgment functions. It is a general distinguishing mark of both types that their life is, to a great extent, subordinated to rational judgment. But we have to consider whether by rational we are speaking from a standpoint of the individual subjective psychology or from that of the observer who perceives and judges from without. This observer could easily arrive at a contrary judgment, especially if he intuitively apprehended merely the outward behavior of the person observed and judged accordingly. On the whole, the life of this type is never dependent on rational judgment alone. It is influenced in almost equal degree by unconscious irrationality. If observation is restricted to outward behavior, without any concern for the internal economy of the individual's consciousness, one may get an even stronger impression of the irrational and fortuitous nature of certain unconscious manifestations than of the reasonableness of his conscious intentions and motivations. I therefore base my judgment on what the individual feels to be her conscious psychology. But I am willing to grant that one could equally well conceive and present such a psychology from precisely the opposite angle. I am also convinced that, had I myself chanced to possess a different psychology, I would have described the rational type in the reverse way, from the standpoint of the unconscious, as irrational, therefore. This aggravates the difficulty of lucid presentation of the psychological matters, and immeasurably increases the possibility of misunderstandings. The arguments provoked by these misunderstandings are, as a rule, quite hopeless, because each side is speaking at cross purposes. The experience is one reason the more for basing my presentation on the conscious psychology of the individual, since there at least we have a definite objective footing, which completely drops away the moment we try to base our psychological rationale on the unconscious. For in that case, the observed object would have no voice in the matter at all, because there is nothing about which he is more uninformed than his own unconscious. The judgment is left entirely to the subjective observer, a sure guarantee that it would be based on his own individual psychology, which would be forcibly imposed on the observed. To my mind, this is the case with the psychologies of both Freud and Adler. The individual is completely at the mercy of the judging observer, which can never be the case when the conscious psychology of the observed is accepted as a basis. She, after all, is the only competent judge, since she alone knows her conscious motives. The rationality that characterizes the conscious conduct of life in both these types involves a deliberate exclusion of everything irrational and accidental. Rational judgment, in such a psychology, is a force that coerces the untidiness and fortuitousness of life into a definite pattern, or at least tries to do so. A definite choice is made from among all the possibilities it offers, only the rational one being accepted. But on the other hand, the dependence and influence of the psychic function which aid the perception of life's happenings are consequently restricted. Naturally, this restriction of sensation and intuition is not absolute. These functions can exist as before, but their products are subject to the choice made by rational judgment. It is not the intensity of a sensation as such that decides action, for instance, but judgment. Thus, in a sense, the function of perception share the same fate as feeling in the case of the first type, or thinking in that of the second. They are relatively repressed, and therefore in an inferior state of differentiation. This gives a peculiar stamp to the unconscious of both types. What they can consciously and intentionally do accords with reason, their reason, of course, but what happens to them accords with the nature of infantile primitive sensations and intuitions. At all events, What happens to these types is irrational from their standpoint, but since there are vast numbers of people for whom lives consist more of what happens to them than of actions governed by irrational intentions, such a person, after observing them closely, might easily describe both our types as irrational. But one has to admit that only too often a man's unconscious makes a far stronger impression on an observer than his consciousness does, and that his actions are of considerably more importance than his rational intentions. The rationality of both types is object-oriented and dependent on objective data. It accords with what is collectively considered to be rational. For them, nothing is rational save what is generally considered as such. Reason, however, is in large part subjective and individual. In our types, this part is repressed, and increasingly so as the object gains its importance. But the subject and his subjective reason, therefore, are in constant danger of repression, and when they succumb to it they fall under the tyranny of the unconscious, which, in this case, possesses very unpleasant qualities. Of its peculiar thinking we have already spoken, but, besides that, there are primitive sensations that express themselves compulsively, for instance in the form of compulsive pleasure-seeking in every conceivable form. There are also primitive intuitions that can become a positive torture to the person concerned and to everybody in his vicinity. Everything that is unpleasant and painful, everything that is disgusting, hateful, and evil is sniffed out or suspected, and in the most cases it is a half-truth calculated to provide misunderstanding of the most poisonous kind. The antagonistic unconscious elements are so strong that they frequently disrupt the conscious rule of reason, and the individual becomes the victim of chance happenings, which exercise a compulsive influence over him, either because they pander to his sensations or because it intuits their unconscious significance. Sensation. Sensation in the extroverted attitude is preeminently conditioned by the object. As sense perception, sensation is naturally dependent on objects, but, just as naturally, it is also dependent on the subject, for which reason there is subjective sensation of a kind entirely different from objective sensation. In the extroverted attitude, the subjective component of sensation, so far as its conscious application is concerned, is either inhibited or repressed. Similarly, as an irrational function, sensation is largely repressed when thinking or feeling holds prior place. That is to say, it is a conscious function only to the extent that the rational attitude of consciousness permits accidental perceptions to become conscious contents. In a word, registers them. The sensory function is, of course, absolute in the strictest sense. Everything is seen or heard, for instance, to the psychological limit, but not everything attains the threshold value a perception must have in order to be appreciated. It is different when sensation itself is paramount instead of merely seconding another function. In this case, no element of objective sensation is excluded and nothing is repressed, except the subjective component already mentioned. As sensation is chiefly conditioned by the object, those objects that excite the strongest sensations will be decisive for the individual's psychology. The result is a strong, sensuous tie to the object. Sensation is therefore a vital function equipped with the strongest vital instinct. Objects are valued insofar as they excite sensations, and, so far as lies within the power of sensation, they are fully accepted into consciousness, whether they are compatible with rational judgment or not. The sole criterion of their value is the intensity of the sensation produced by their objective qualities. Accordingly, all objective processes which excite any sensation at all make their appearance in consciousness. However, it is only concrete, sensuously perceived objects or processes that excite sensation for the extrovert. These exclusively, which everyone everywhere would sense as concrete. Hence the orientation of such an individual accords with purely sensuous reality. The judging rational functions are subordinated to the concrete facts of sensation, and thus have all the qualities of less differentiated functions, exhibiting negative, infantile, and archaic traits. The functions most repressed is naturally the opposite of sensation, intuition, the function of unconscious perception. Although this does not by any means imply an absolute lawlessness and lack of restraint, it nevertheless deprives him of the essential restraining power of judgment. But rational judgment is a conscious coercion which the rational type appears to impose on himself of his own free will. The coercion overtakes the sensation type from the unconscious in the form of compulsion. Moreover, the very existence of a judgment means that the rational type's relation to the object will never become an absolute tie. It is in the case of the sensation, as in the case of the sensation type. When his attitude attains an abnormal degree of one-sidedness, therefore, he is in danger of being overpowered by the unconscious in the same measure as he is consciously in the grip of the object. If he should become neurotic, it is much harder to treat him by rational means, because of the functions which the analyst must turn to are in a relatively undifferentiated state, and little or no reliance can be placed on them. Special techniques for bringing emotional pressure to bear are often needed in order to make him at all conscious. Intuition. In the extroverted attitude, intuition, as the function of unconscious perception, is wholly directed to external objects. Because intuition is the main of an unconscious process, its nature is very difficult to grasp. The intuitive function is repressed in consciousness by an attitude of expectancy, by vision and penetration, but only from the subsequent result can it be established how much of what was seen was actually in the object and how much was read into it. Just as sensation, when it is the dominant function, is not a mere reactive process of no further significance for the object, but an activity that seizes and shapes its object, so intuition is not mere perception or vision, but an active creative process that puts into the object just as much as it takes out. Since it does this unconsciously, it also has an unconscious effect on the object. The primary function of intuition, however, is simply to transmit images or perceptions of relations between things, which could not be transmitted by other functions or only in a very roundabout way. These images have the value of specific insights which have a decisive influence on actions whenever intuition is given priority. In this case, psychic adaptation will be grounded almost entirely on intuitions. Thinking, feeling, and sensation are then largely repressed, sensation being the one most affected because, as the conscious state function, it offers the greatest obstacle to intuition. Sensation is a hindrance to clear, unbiased, naive perception. Its intrusive sensory stimuli direct attention to the physical surface, to the very things round and beyond which intuition tries to peer. But since extroverted intuition is directed predominantly to objects, it actually comes very close to sensation. Indeed, the expectant attitude to external objects is just as likely to make use of sensation. Hence, if intuition is to function properly, sensation must to a large extent be suppressed. By sensation, I mean in this instance the simple and immediate sense impression understood as a clearly defined psychological and physic datum. This must be expressly established beforehand because, if I ask an intuitive how he orients himself, he will speak of things that are almost indistinguishable from self-impression. Very often he will even use the word sensation. He does have sensations, of course, but he is not guided by them as such. He uses them merely as starting points for his perception. He selects them by unconscious predilection. It is not the strongest sensation, in the psychological sense, that is accorded the chief value, but any sensation whatever whose value is enhanced by the intuitive's unconscious attitude. In this way it may eventually come to acquire the chief value, and to his conscious mind it will appear to be just pure sensation. But it actually is not so. Just as extroverted sensation strives to reach the highest pitch of actuality, because this alone can give the appearance of a full life, so intuition tries to apprehend the widest range of possibilities, since only through envisioning possibilities is intuition fully satisfied. It seeks to discover what possibilities the objective situation holds in store. Hence, as a subordinate function, i.e., when not in the position of a priority, it is the auxiliary that automatically comes into play when no other function can find a way out of a hopelessly blocked situation. When it is the dominant function, every ordinary sensation in life seems like a locked room which intuition has to open. It is constantly seeking fresh outlets and new possibilities in external life. In a very short time, every existing situation becomes a prison for the intuitive, a chain that has to be broken. For a time, objects appear to have exaggerated value, if they should serve to bring about a new solution of deliverance or lead to a discovery of a new possibility. Yet no sooner have they served their purpose as a stepping stone or bridges than they lose their value altogether, and they are discarded as burdensome appendages. Facts are acknowledged only if they are open new possibilities of advancing beyond them and delivering to the individual from their power. Nascent possibilities are compelling motives from which intuition cannot escape and to which all else must be sacrificed. The extroverted intuitive type. Whenever intuition predominates, a peculiar and unmistakable psychology results. Because extroverted intuition is oriented by the object, there is a marked dependence on external situations, but it is altogether different from the dependence of the sensation type. The intuitive is never to be found in a world of accepted reality values, but she has a keen nose for anything new and in the making. Because she was always seeking out new possibilities, stable conditions suffocate her. She seizes on new objects or situations with great intensity, sometimes with extraordinary enthusiasm, only to abandon them cold-bloodedly, without any compunction, and apparently without remembering them, as soon as their range is known and no further developments can be divined. So long as a new possibility is in the offing, the intuitive is bound to it with the shackles of fate. It is as though her whole life vanished in the new situation. One gets the impression, which she herself shares, that she has always just reached a final turning point, and that from now on she can think and feel nothing else, no matter how reasonable and suitable it may be, and although every conceivable argument speaks for its stability, a day will come when nothing will deter her from regarding as a prison the very situation that seemed to promise her freedom and deliverance, and from acting accordingly. Neither reason nor feeling can restrain her or frighten her away from the new possibility, even though it goes against all her previous convictions. Thinking and feeling, the indisputable components of conviction, are her inferior function, carrying no weight and hence incapable of effectively withstanding the power of intuition. And yet these functions are the only ones that could compensate for its supremacy by supplying the judgment which the intuitive type totally lacks. The intuitive's morality is governed neither by thinking nor by feeling. She has her own characteristic morality, which consists in a loyalty to her vision and involuntary submission to its authority. Consideration for this welfare of others is weak. Their psychic well-being counts as little with her as does her own. She has equally little regard for their convictions and way of life, and on this account she is often put down as immoral or an unscrupulous adventurer. Since her intuition is concerned with externals, without ferreting out their possibilities, she readily turns to professions in which she can exploit those capacities to the full. Many business tycoons, entrepreneurs, speculators, stockbrokers, politicians, etc., belong to this type. It would seem to be more common among women, however, than among men. In women, the intuitive capacity shows itself not so much in the professional life as in the social sphere. Such women understand the art of exploiting every social occasion. They make the right social connections. They seek out men with prospects only to abandon everything again for the sake of a new possibility. It goes without saying that such a type is uncommonly important, both emotionally and culturally. If her intuitions are good, i.e., her attitude is not too egocentric, she can render exceptional service as the initiator or promoter of new enterprises. She is the natural champion of all minorities with a future. Because she was able, when oriented more to people than to things, to make an intuitive diagnosis of their abilities and possibilities, she can also make, quote-unquote, make men. Her capacity to inspire courage and to kindle enthusiasm for anything new is unrivaled, although she may already have dropped it by the morrow. The stronger her intuition, the more her ego becomes fused with all the possibilities she envisions. She brings her vision to life, she presents it convincingly, and with dramatic flair she embodies it, so to speak, but this is not play acting, it is a kind of fate. Naturally, this attitude holds great dangers, for all too easily the intuitive may fritter away her life on things and people, spreading about her an abundance of life which others live, and not she herself. If only she could stay put, she would reap the fruits of her labors, but always she must be running after a new possibility, quitting her newly planned fields, while others gather the harvest. In the end, she goes away empty, but when the intuitive lets things come to a pass, she also has her own unconsciousness against her. The unconscious of the intuitive bears some resemblance to that of the sensation type. Thinking and feeling, being largely repressed, come up with infantile, anarchic thoughts, and feelings similar to those of the countertype. They take the form of intense projections which are just as absurd as hers, though they seem to lack the magical character of the latter and are chiefly concerned with quasi-realities such as sexual superstitions, financial hazards, forebodings of illness, etc. The difference seems to be due to the repression of real sensations. These make themselves felt when, for instance, the intuitive suddenly finds herself entangled with a highly unsuitable man, or, in the case of a woman, a highly unsuitable woman, because these persons have stirred up archaic sensations. This leads to an unconscious, compulsive tie which bodes nobody any good. Cases of this kind are themselves symptomatic of compulsion, to which the intuitive is as prone as the sensation type. She claims a similar freedom and exemption from restraint, submitting her decisions to no rational judgment and relying entirely on her nose for the possibility that chance throws her way. She exempts herself from the restriction of reason only to fall victim to neurotic compulsions in the form of over-subtle radiocitations, hair-splitting dialectics, and a compulsive tie to the sensations aroused by the object. Her conscious attitude towards both sensation and object is one of ruthless superiority. Not that she means to be ruthless or superior, she simply does not see the object that everyone else sees, and rides roughshod over it, just as the sensation type has no eyes for its soul. But sooner or later the object takes revenge in the form of compulsive hypochondriacal ideas, phobias, and every imaginable kind of absurd bodily situation. Summary of the extroverted irrational types. I call the two preceding types irrational for the reason previously discussed, namely that whatever they do or do not do is based not on rational judgment, but on the sheer intensity of perception. Their perception is directed simply and solely to events as they happen, no selection being made by judgment. In this respect, they have a decided advantage over the two judging types. Objective events both conform to law and are accidental. Insofar as they conform to law, they are accessible to reason. Insofar as they are accidental, they are not. Conversely, we might also say that an event conforms to law when it presents an aspect accessible to reason, and that when it presents an aspect for which we can find no law, we call it accidental. The postulate of universal lawfulness is a postulate of reason alone, but in no sense is it a postulate of our perceptive functions. Since these are in no way based on the principle of reason and its postulates, they are by their very nature irrational. This is why I call the perception types irrational by nature. But merely because they are subordinate judgment to perception, it would be quite wrong to regard them as unreasonable. It would be truer to say that they are the highest degree empirical. They base themselves exclusively on experience, so exclusively that, as a rule, their judgment cannot keep pace with their experience. But the judging functions are none the less present, although they eke out a largely unconscious existence. Since the unconscious, in spite of its separation from the conscious subject as always appearing on the scene, we notice in the actual life of the irrational types striking judgments and acts of choice, but they take the form of apparent sophistries, cold-hearted criticisms, and seemingly calculating choices of persons and situations. These traits have a rather infantile and even primitive character. Both types can on occasion be astonishingly naive, as well as ruthless, brusque, and violent. To the rational types, the real character of these people might well appear rationalistic and calculating in the worst sense. But this judgment would be valid only for their unconscious, and therefore quite incorrect for their conscious psychology, which is entirely oriented by perception, and because of its irrational nature, is quite unintelligible to any rational judgment. To the rational mind, it might even seem that such a hodgepodge of accidentals hardly deserve the name psychology at all. The irrational type ripostes with an equally contemptuous opinion of his opposite number. He sees him as something only half alive, whose sole aim is to fasten the fetters of reason on everything living and strangle it with judgments. These are crass extremes, but they nevertheless occur. From the standpoint of the rational type, the other might easily be represented as an inferior kind of rationalist, when, that is to say, he is judged by what happened to him. For what happens to him is not accident. Here, he is the master. Instead, the accidents that befall him take the form of rational judgments and rational intentions, and these are the things that he stumbles over. To the rational mind, this is something almost unthinkable, but its unthinkableness merely equals the astonishment of the irrational type when he comes up against someone who puts rational ideas above actual and living happenings. Such a thing seems to him scarcely credible. As a rule, it is quite hopeless to discuss these things with him as questions of principle, for all rational communication is just as alien and repellent to him as it would be unthinkable for the rationalist to enter into a contract without mutual consultation and obligation. This brings me to the problem of the psychic relationship between the two types. Following the terminology of the French school of hypnosis, psychic relationship is known in modern psychology as rapport. Rapport consists essentially in a feeling of agreement in spite of acknowledged differences. Indeed, the recognition of existent differences, if it is to be mutual, is itself a rapport, a feeling of agreement. If in a given case we make this feeling conscious to a higher degree than usual, we discover that it is not just a feeling whose nature cannot be analyzed further, but at the same time an insight or a content of a cognition which presents the point of agreement in conceptual form. This rational presentation is valid only for the rational types, not only for the rational types. But this rational presentation is valid only for the rational types, but not for the irrational, whose rapport is based not on judgment, but on parallelism of every living event. His feeling of agreement comes from the common perception of a sensation or intuition. The rational type would say that rapport with the irrational depends purely on chance. If, by some accident, the objective situations are exactly in tune, something like a human relationship takes place, but nobody can tell how valid it is or how long it will last. To the rational type, it is often a painful thought that the relationship will last just as long as external circumstances and chance provide a common interest. This does not seem to him particularly human, whereas it is precisely in this that the irrational type sees a human situation of a particular beauty. The result is that each regards the other as a man destitute of relationships, who cannot be relied upon, and with whom one can never get on decent terms. This unhappy outcome, however, is reached only when one makes a conscious effort to assess the nature of one's relationship with others. But since this kind of psychological consciousness is not very common, it frequently happens that despite an absolute difference of standpoint and rapport, nevertheless comes about in the following way. One party, by unspoken projection, assumes that the other is, in all essentials, of the same opinion as himself, while the other divines or senses an objective community of interest, of which, however, the former has no conscious inkling, and whose existence he would at once dispute, just as it would never occur to the other that his relationship should be based on a common point of view. A rapport of this kind is far more frequent. It rests on mutual projection, which later becomes the source of many misunderstandings. Psychic relationship in the extroverted attitude is always governed by objective factors and external determinants. What a man is within himself is never of any decisive significance. For our present-day culture, the extroverted attitude to the problem of human relationships is the principle that counts. Naturally, the introverted principle occurs too, but it is still the exception and has to appeal to the tolerance of the age. 3. The introverted type. A. The general attitude of consciousness. As I have already explained in the previous section, the introvert is distinguished from the extrovert by the fact that she does not, like the latter, orient herself by the object and by objective data, but by subjective factors. I also mentioned that the introvert interposes a subjective view with a perception of the object and her own actions, which prevents the action from assuming a character that fits the objective situation. Naturally, this is a special instance, mentioned by way of example and intended to serve only as a simple illustration. We must not attempt a formulation on a broader basis. Although the introverted consciousness is naturally aware of external conditions, it selects the subjective determinants as the decisive ones. It is therefore oriented by the factors in perception and cognition which respond to the sense stimulus in accordance with the individual's subjective disposition. For example, two people see the same object, but they never see it in the same way that the images they receive are absolutely identical. Quite apart from the variable acuteness of the sense organs and the personal equation, there often exists a radical difference, both in kind and in degree, in the psychic assimilation of the perceptual image. Whereas the extrovert continually appeals to what comes to her from the object, the introvert relies principally on what the sense impression constellates in the subject. The difference in the case of a single apperception may, of course, be very delicate, but in the total psychic economy it makes itself felt in the highest degree, particularly in the effect it has on the ego. I may anticipate I consider the viewpoint which includes, with Weininger, to describe the introverted attitude as philautic, autoerotic, egocentric, subjectivistic, egoistic, etc. This would be misleading in principle and thoroughly depreciatory. It reflects the normal bias of the extroverted attitude in regard to the nature of the introvert. We must not forget, although the extrovert is only too prone to do so, that perception and cognition are not purely objective but also subjectively conditioned. The world exists not merely in itself, but also as it appears to me. Indeed, at bottom, we have absolutely no criterion that could help us to form a judgment of a world which was unassailable by the subject. If we were to ignore the subjective factor, it would be complete denial of the great doubt as to the possibility of an absolute cognition. This would mean a relapse into the stale and hollow positivism that marred the turn of the century, an attitude of intellectual arrogance accompanied by crudeness of feeling, a violation of life as stupid as it is presumptuous. By overvaluing our capacity for objective cognition, we repress the importance of the subjective factor, which simply means a denial of the subject. But what is the subject? The subject is man himself. We are the subject. Only a sick mind could forget that cognition must have a subject, and that there is no knowledge whatsoever and no world at all unless I know, as has been said. Although this statement one has already expressed the subjective limitation of all knowledge. This applies to all psychic functions. They have a subject which is just as indispensable as the object. It is characteristic of our present extroverted sense of values that the word subjective usually sounds like a reproof. At all events, the epithet merely subjective is brandished like a weapon over the head of anyone who is not boundlessly convinced of the absolute superiority of the object. We must therefore be quite clear as to what subjective means in this inquiry. By subjective factor, I understand that psychological action or a reaction which merges with the effect produced by an object, and so gives rise to a new psychic datum. Insofar as the subjective factor has, from the earliest times and among all people, remained in large measure constant, elementary perceptions and cognitions being almost universally the same, it is a reality that is just as firmly established as the external object. If this were not so, any sort of permanent and essentially unchanging reality would be simply inconceivable, and any understanding of the past would be impossible. In this sense, therefore, the subjective factor is as ineluctable a datum as the extent of the sea and the radius of the earth. By the same token, the subjective factor has all the value of a codeterminate of the world we live in, a factor that can on no account be left out of our calculations. It is another universal law, and whoever bases herself on it as a foundation has a foundation as secure, as permanent, and as valid as the man who relies on the object. But just as the object and objective data do not remain permanently the same, being perishable and subject to chance, so too the subjective factor is subject to variation and individual hazards. For this reason, its value is also merely relative. That is to say, the excessive development of the introverted standpoint does not lead to a better and sounder use of the subjective factor, but rather to an artificial subjectivizing of consciousness, which can hardly escape the reproach merely subjective. This is then counterbalanced by a desubjectification, which takes the form of an exaggerated extroverted attitude, an attitude aptly described by Weininger as misoustic. But since the introverted attitude is based on the ever-present, extremely real, and absolutely indispensable fact of psychic adaptation, expressions like philautic, egocentric, and so on, are out of place and objectionable because they arouse prejudice that is always the question of the beloved ego. Nothing could be more mistaken than such an assumption. Yet one is continually meeting it in the judgments of the extrovert on the introvert. Not, of course, that I wish to ascribe this error to individual extrovert. It is rather to be put down to a generally accepted extroverted type, which is by no means restricted to the extroverted type. For it has just as many representatives among introverts, very much to their own detriment. The reproach of being untrue to their own nature can justly be levelled at the latter, whereas this cannot be held against the former. The introvert attitude is normally oriented by the psychic structure, which is in principle hereditary and inborn in the subject. This must not be assumed, however, to be simply identical with the subject's ego, as is implied by the above designations of Weininger. It is rather the psychic structure of the subject prior to any ego development. The really fundamental subject, the self, is far more comprehensive than the ego, since the former includes the unconscious, whereas the latter is essentially the focal point of consciousness. Where the ego identifies with the self, it would be inconceivable how we could sometimes see ourselves in dreams in quite different forms and with entirely different meanings. But it is characteristic particularly of the introvert, which is as much in keeping with his own inclination as with the general bias, to confuse his ego with the self, and to exalt it as the subject of the psychic process, thus bringing about the aforementioned subjectivization of consciousness, which alienates him from the object. The psychic structure is the same as what Simon calls mneme, and what I call the collective unconscious. The individual self is a portion or segment of representation of something present in all living creatures, an exponent of specific mode of psychological behavior, which varies from species to species and is inborn in each of its members. The inborn mode of acting has long been known as instinct, and for the inborn mode of psychic apprehension I have proposed the term archetype. I may assume that what is understood by instinct is familiar to everyone. It is another matter with archetype. What I understand by it is identical with primordial image, a term borrowed from Jacob Brunkart, and I describe it as such in the definitions that conclude this book. I must here refer the reader to the definition image. The archetype is a symbolic formation which always begins to function when there are no conscious ideas present, or when conscious ideas are inhibited for internal and external reasons. The contents of the collective unconscious are represented in consciousness in the form of pronounced preferences and definite ways of looking at things. These subjective tendencies and views are generally regarded by the individual as being determined by the object, incorrectly, since they have their source in the unconscious structure of the psyche and are merely released by the effect of the object. They are stronger than the object's influence, their psychic value is higher, so they superimpose themselves on all impressions. Thus, just as it seems incomprehensible to the extrovert that the object should always be the decisive factor, it remains an enigma to the extrovert how a subjective standpoint can be superior to the objective situation. She inevitably comes to the conclusion that the introvert is either a conceited egoist or a cracked-brained bigot. Today she would be suspected of harboring an unconscious power complex. The introvert certainly lays herself open to these suspicions, for her positive, highly generalizing manner of expression, which appears to rule out every other opinion from the start, lends countenance to all the extrovert's prejudices. Moreover, the inflexibility of her subjective judgment, setting itself above all objective data, is sufficient in itself to create the impression of marked egocentricity. Faced with the prejudice that the introvert is usually at a loss for the right argument, for she is quite unaware of the unconscious, but generally quite valid assumptions on which her subjective judgment and her subjective perceptions are based. In the fashion of the times, she looks outside for an answer instead of seeking it behind her own consciousness. Should she become neurotic, it is the sign of an almost complete identity of the ego with the self. The importance of the self is reduced to null, while the ego is inflated beyond measure. The whole world-creating force of the subjective factor becomes concentrated in the ego, producing a boundless power complex and a fatuous egocentricity. Every psychology which reduces the essence of man to the unconscious power drive springs from this kind of disposition. Many of Nietzsche's lapses in taste, for example, are due to the subjectivization of consciousness. B. The attitude of unconscious. The predominance of the subjective factor in consciousness naturally involves a devaluation of the object. The object is not given the importance that belongs to it by right. Just as it plays too great a role in the extroverted attitude, it has too little meaning for the introvert. To the extent that his consciousness is subjectivized and excessive importance attached to the ego, the object is put in a position which in the end becomes untenable. The object is a factor whose power cannot be denied, whereas the ego is a very limited and fragile thing. It would be a very different matter if the self opposed the object. Self and world are commensurable factors. Hence, a normal introverted attitude is as justifiable and valid as a normal extroverted attitude. But if the ego is usurped by the claims of the subject, this naturally produces, by way of compensation, an unconscious reinforcement of the influence of the object. In spite of positively convulsive efforts to ensure the superiority of the ego, the object comes to exert an overwhelming influence, which is all the more invincible because it seizes on the individual unawares and forcibly obtrudes itself on his consciousness. As a result of the ego's unadapted relation to the object, for a desire to dominate, it is not an adaptation. A compensatory relation arises in the unconscious, which makes itself feel as an absolute and irrepressible tie to the object. The more the ego struggles to preserve its independence, freedom from obligation and superiority, the more it becomes enslaved to the objective data. The individual's freedom of mind is fettered by the ignominy of his financial dependence, his freedom of action trembles in the face of public opinion, his moral superiority collapses in a morass of inferior relationships, and his desire to dominate ends in pitiful craving to be loved. It is now the unconscious that takes care of the relation to the object, and it does so in a way that is calculated to bring the illusion of power and the fantasy of superiority to utter ruin. The object assumes terrifying proportions in spite of the conscious attempt to degrade it. Inconsequent, the ego's efforts to detach itself from the object and get it under control become all the more violent. In the end, it surrounds itself with a regular system of defenses, aptly described by Adler, for the purpose of preserving at least the illusion of superiority. The introvert's alienation from the object is now complete. He wears himself out with the defense measures on the one hand, while on the other he makes fruitless attempts to impose his will on the object and assert himself. These efforts are constantly being frustrated by the overwhelming impressions received from the object. It continually imposes itself on him against his will. It arouses in him the most disagreeable and intractable affects and persecutes him at every step. A tremendous inner struggle is needed all the time in order to keep going. The typical form his neurosis takes is psychasthenia, a malady characterized on the one hand by extreme sensitivity and on the other by great proneness to exhaustion and chronic fatigue. An analysis of the personal unconscious reveals a mass of power fantasies coupled with fear of objects which he himself has forcibly activated, and of which he is often enough the victim. His fear of objects develops into a peculiar kind of cowardliness. He shrinks away from making himself or his opinions felt, fearing that this will only increase the object's power. He is terrified of strong affects on others, and is hardly ever free from the dread of falling under hostile influences. Objects possess puissance and terrifying qualities for him, qualities he cannot cannot consciously discern in them, for which he imagines he sees through his unconscious perception. As his relation to the object is very largely repressed, it takes place via the unconscious, where it becomes charged with the latter's qualities. These qualities are mostly infantile and archaic, so that the relation to the object becomes primitive too, and the object seems endowed with magical powers. Anything strange and new arouses fear and mistrust, although concealing unknown perils. Heirlooms and such like are attached to his soul by the invisible thread. Any change is upsetting, if not positively dangerous, as it seems to denote a magical animation of the object. His ideal is a lonely island where nothing moves except what he permits to move. Vischer's novel Ouch Einer affords deep insight into this side of the introvert psychology, but also into the underlying symbolism of the collective unconscious. But this latter question I must leave to one side, since it is not specific to a description of types, but to a general phenomenon. E. The peculiarities of the basic psychological functions in the introverted attitude. Thinking. In the section on extroverted thinking, I gave a brief description of introverted thinking, and must refer to it again here. Introverted thinking is primarily oriented by the subjective factor. At the very least, the subjective factor expresses itself as a feeling of guidance, which ultimately determines judgment. Sometimes it appears as more or less complete image, which serves as a criterion. But whether introverted thinking is concerned with concrete or with abstract objects, always at the decisive point it is oriented by subjective data. It does not lead from concrete experience back again to the object, but always to the subjective content. External facts are not the aim and origin of this thinking, although the introvert would often like to make his thinking appear so. It begins with the subject and leads back to the subject, far though it may range into the realm of actual reality. With regard to the establishment of new facts, it is only indirectly of value, since new views, rather than knowledge of new facts, are its main concern. It formulates questions and creates theories. It opens up new prospects and insights. But with regard to facts, its attitude is one of reserve. They are all very well as illustrative examples, but they must not be allowed to predominate. Facts are collected as evidence for a theory, never for their own sake. If ever this happens, it is merely a concession to the extroverted style. Facts are of secondary importance for this kind of thinking, which seems to it a paramount of importance in the development and presentation of the subjective idea, of the initial symbolic image hovering darkly over the mind's eye. Its aim is never an intellectual reconstruction of the concentric fact, but a shaping of that dark image into a luminous idea. It wants to reach reality, to see how the external fact will fit into and fill the framework of the idea, and the creative power of this thinking shows itself when it actually creates an idea which, although not inherent in the concrete fact, is yet the most suitable abstract expression of it. Its task is completed when the idea it has fashioned seems to emerge so inevitably from the external facts that they actually prove its validity. But no more than extroverted thinking can wrest a sound, empirical concept from concrete facts or create new ones, can introverted thinking translate the initial image into an idea adequately adapted for the facts. For, as in the former case, the purely empirical accumulation of facts paralyzes the thought and smothers their meaning, so in the latter case, introverted thinking shows a dangerous tendency to force the facts into the shape of an image, or to ignore them altogether in order to give fantasy free play. In that event, it will be impossible for the finished product, the idea, to repudiate its derivation from the dim, archaic image. It will have a mythological streak which one is apt to interpret as originality, or, in more pronounced cases, as merely whimsical, since its archaic character is not immediately apparent to specialists unfamiliar with mythological motifs. The subjective power of conviction exerted by an idea of this kind is usually very great, and it is all the greater the less it comes into contact with external facts. Although it may seem to the originator of the idea that her meager store of facts is the actual source of its truth and validity, in reality this is not so, for the idea derives in convincing power from the unconscious archetype, which, as such, is externally valid and true. But this truth is so universal and so symbolic that it must first be assimilated to the recognized and recognizable knowledge of the time before it can be a practical truth of any value for life. What would causality be, for instance, if it could nowhere be recognized in practical causes and practical effects? This kind of thinking easily gets lost in the immense truth of the subjective factor. It creates theories for their own sake, apparently with an eye to real or at least possible facts, but always with a distinct tendency to slip over from the world of ideas into mere imagery. Accordingly, visions of numerous possibilities appear on the scene, but none of them ever become a reality, until finally images are produced which no longer express anything externally real, being mere symbols of the ineffable and unknowable. It is now merely mystical thinking, and quite as unfruitful as thinking that remains bound to objective data. Whereas the latter sinks to the level of mere representation of facts, the former evaporates into a representation of the irrepresentable, far beyond anything that could be expressed in an image. The representation of facts has an incontestable truth because the subjective factor is excluded, and facts speak for themselves. Similarly, the representation of the irrepresentable has an immediate subjective power of conviction because it demonstrates its own existence. The one says est ergo est, the other says cognito ergo cognito. Introverted thinking, carried to an extreme, arrives at the evidence of its own subjective existence, and extroverted thinking at the evidence of its complete identity with the objective fact. Just as the latter abnegates itself by evaporating into the object, the former empties itself of each and every content and has to be satisfied with merely existing. In both cases, the further development of life is crowded out by the thinking function into the domain of the other psychic functions, which till then had existed in a state of relative unconsciousness. The extraordinary impoverishment of introverted thinking is compensated by a wealth of unconscious facts. The more consciousness is impelled by the thinking function to confine itself within the smallest and emptiest circle, which seems, however, to contain all the riches of the gods, the more the unconscious fantasies will be enriched by a multitude of archaic contents, a veritable pandemonium of irrational and magical figures, whose physiognomy will accord with the nature of the function that will supersede the thinking function as a vehicle of life. If it should be the intuitive function, then the other side will be viewed through the eyes of a Kuben or a Meyers-Briggs. If it is the feeling function, then quite unheard of and fantastic relationships will be formed, coupled with contradictory and unintelligible value judgment. If it is the sensation function, the senses will nose up something new and never experienced before in and outside the body. Closer examination of these permutations will easily demonstrate a recrudescence of primitive psychology and all its characteristic features. Naturally, such experiences are not merely primitive, they are also symbolic. In fact, the more primordial and aboriginal they are, the more they represent a future truth. For everything old in the unconscious hints at something coming. Under ordinary circumstances, even when the attempt to get to the other side will be successful, and still less the redeeming journey through the unconscious, the passage across is usually blocked by conscious resistance of any subjection of the ego to the realities of the unconscious and their determining power. It is a state of disassociation, in other words, a neurosis characterized by inner debility and increasing cerebral exhaustion, the symptoms of psych anesthesia. The introverted thinking type. Just as we might take Darwin as an example of the normal extroverted thinking type, the normal introverted thinking type could be represented by Kant. The one speaks with facts, the other relies on the subjective factor. Darwin ranges over the wide field of objective reality. Kant restricts himself to a critique of knowledge. Cuvier and Nietzsche would form an even sharper contrast. The introverted thinking type is characterized by the primacy of the kind of thinking I have just described. Like her extroverted counterpart, she is strongly influenced by ideas, though her ideas have their origin not in objective data but in her subjective foundation. She will follow her ideas like the extrovert, but in the reverse direction, inwards and not outwards. Intensity is her aim, not extensity. In these fundamental respects, she differs quite unmistakably from her extroverted counterpart. What distinguishes the other, namely her intense relation to objects, is almost completely lacking in her, as in every introverted type. If the object is a person, this person has a distinct feeling that she matters only in a negative way. In milder cases, she is merely conscious of being de trop, but with more extreme types, she feels herself warded off as something defiantly disturbing. This negative relation to the object, ranging from indifference to aversion, characterizes every introvert and makes a description of the type exceedingly difficult. Everything about her tends to disappear and get concealed. Her judgment appears cold, inflexible, arbitrary, and ruthless because it relates far less to the object than to the subject. One can feel nothing in it that might possibly confer a higher value on the object. It always bypasses the object and leaves one with a feeling of the subject's superiority. She may be polite, amiable, and kind, but one is constantly aware of a certain uneasiness betraying an ulterior motive, the disarming of an opponent, who must at all costs be pacified and placated lest she prove herself a nuisance. In no sense, of course, is she an opponent, but if she is at all sensitive, she will feel herself repulsed and even belittled. Invariably, the object has to submit to a certain amount of neglect, and in pathological cases it is even surrounded with quite unnecessary precautionary measures. This type tends to vanish behind a cloud of misunderstanding, which gets all the thicker the more she attempts to assume, by way of compensation and with the help of her inferior functions, an air of urbanity which contrasts glaringly with her real nature. Although she will shrink from danger in building up her world of ideas, and never shrinks from thinking a thought because it could prove to be dangerous, subversive, heretical, or wounding to other people's feelings, she is none the less beset by the greatest anxiety that if ever she has to make it an objective reality. This goes against the grain, and when she does put her ideas into the world, she never introduces them like a mother solicitous for her children, but simply dumps them there and gets extremely annoyed if they fail to thrive on their own account. Her amazing unpracticalness and the horror of publicity in any form have a hand in this. If in her eyes her product appears correct and true, then it must be so in practice, and others have got to bow to its truth. Hardly ever will he go out of her way to win anyone's appreciation of it, especially anyone of influence. And if she ever brings herself to do so, she generally sets about it so clumsily that it has just the opposite of effect as that intended. She usually has had bad experiences with rivals in her own field because she never understands how to curry their favor. As a rule, she only succeeds in showing them how entirely superfluous they are to her. In the pursuit of her own ideas, she is generally stubborn, headstrong, and quite unamiable to influence. Her suggestibility to personal influences is in strange contrast to this. She has only to be convinced of a person's seeming innocuousness to lay herself open to the most undesirable elements. They seize hold of her from the unconscious. She lets herself be brutalized and exploited in the most ignominious way if only she can be left in peace to pursue her ideas. She simply does not want not to see when she is being plundered behind her back and wronged in practice, for to her the relation to people and things is secondary, and the objective evaluation of her product is something she remains unconscious of. Because she thinks out her problems to the limit, she complicates them and constantly gets entangled in her own scruples and misgivings. However clear to her the inner structure of her thoughts may be, she is not in the least clear where or how they link up with the world of reality. Only with the greatest difficulty will she bring herself to admit what is clear to her may not be equally clear to everyone. Her style is cluttered with all sorts of adjuncts, accessories, qualifications, retractions, saving clauses, doubts, etc., which all come from from her scrupulosity. Her scrupulosity. Her work goes slowly and with difficulty. In her personal relations, she is taciturn or else throwing herself on people who cannot understand her. And for her, this is one more proof of the abysmal stupidity of man. If for once she is understood, she easily succumbs to credulous overestimation of her prowess. Ambitious women who have only to know how to take advantage of of, of her cluelessness in practical matters to make an easy prey of her. Or she may develop into a misanthrope bachelor with a childlike heart. Often she is gauche in her behavior, painfully anxious to escape notice, or else remarkably unconcerned and childishly naive. In her own special field of work she provokes the most violent opposition, which she has no notion how to deal with, unless she happens to be seduced by her primitive affects into acrimonious and fruitless polemics. Casual acquaintances think she is inconsiderate and domineering, but the better one knows her, the more favorable one's judgment becomes, and her closest friends value her intimacy very highly. To outsiders she seems prickly, unapproachable, arrogant, and sometimes soured as a result of her antisocial prejudices. As a personal teacher she has little influence, since the mentality of her students is strange to her. Besides, teaching has at the bottom no interest for her unless it happens to provide her with a theoretical problem. She is a poor teacher, because all the time she is teaching, her thought is occupied with the material itself and not with the presentation. With the intensification of her type, her convictions become all the more rigid and unbending. Outside influences are shut off. As a person, too, she becomes more unsympathetic to her wider circle of acquaintances, and therefore more dependent on her intimates. Her tone becomes personal and surly. Although her ideas may gain in profundity, they can no longer be adequately expressed in the material at hand. To compensate for this, she falls back into emotionality and touchiness. The outside influences she has brusquely fended off attack her from within, from the unconscious, and in her efforts to defend herself she attacks things that to outsiders seem utterly unimportant. Because of the subjectivization of a consciousness resulting from her lack of relationship to the world, to the object, what secretly concerns her own person now seems to her of extreme importance. She begins to confuse her subjective truth with her own personality. Although she will not try to press her convictions on anyone personally, she will burst out with vicious personal retorts against every criticism, however just. Thus her isolation gradually increases. Her originally fertilizing ideas become destructive, poisoned by the sediment of bitterness. Her struggle against the influence emanating from the unconscious increase with her external isolation, until finally they begin to cripple her. She thinks her withdrawal into ever-increasing solitude will protect her from the unconscious influences, but as a rule it only plunges her deeper into the conflict that is destroying her from within. The thinking of the introverted type is positive and synthetic in developing ideas, which approximate more and more to the external validity of the primordial images. But, as their connection with the objective experiences becomes more and more tenuous, they take on a mythological coloring and no longer hold true for the contemporary situation. Hence, her thinking is of value for her contemporaries only for as long as it is manifestly and intelligibly related to the known facts of the time. Once it has become mythological, it ceases to be relevant and runs on itself. The counterbalancing functions of feeling, intuition, and sensation are comparatively unconscious and inferior. Therefore, we have a primitive, extroverted character that accounts for all the troublesome influences from outside, to which the introverted thinker is prone. The various protective devices and psychological minefields which such people surround themselves with are known to everyone, and I can spare myself a description of them. They all serve as a defense against magical influences, and among them the vague fear of the feminine sex. Feeling. Introverted feeling is determined principally by the subjective factor. It differs quite as essentially from extroverted feeling as introverted from extroverted thinking. It is extremely difficult to give an intellectual account of the introverted feeling process, or even an approximate description of it, although the peculiar nature of this kind of feeling is very noticeable once one has become aware of it. Since it is conditioned subjectively and is only secondarily concerned with the object, it seldom appears on the surface and is generally misunderstood. It is a feeling which seems to devalue the object, and is therefore manifests itself for the most part negatively. The existence of positive feeling can be inferred only indirectly. Its aim is not to adjust itself to the object, but to subordinate in it an unconscious effort to realize the underlying images. It is continually seeking an image which has no existence in reality, but which it has seen in a kind of vision. It glides unheedingly all over objects that do not fit in with its aim. It strives after inner intensity, for which the objects serve at most as a stimulus. The depth of this feeling can only be guessed. It can never really be clearly grasped. It makes people silent and difficult to access. It shrinks back like a violet from the brute nature of the object in order to fill the depths of the subject. It comes out with negative judgments, or assumes an air of profound indifference as a means of defense. The primordial images are, of course, just as much ideas as feeling. Fundamental ideas like God, freedom, immortality are just as much feeling values as they are significant ideas. Everything, therefore, that we have said about introverted thinking is equally true of introverted. Everything that we have said about introverted thinking is equally true of introverted feeling. Only here everything is felt, while there it was thought. But the very fact that thoughts can generally be expressed more intelligibly than feelings demands a more than ordinary description or artistic ability before the real wealth of this feeling can be approximately presented or communicated to the world. If subjective thinking can be understood only with difficulty because of its unrelatedness, it is true an even higher degree of subjective feeling. In order to communicate with others, it has to find an external form not only acceptable to itself, but capable also of arousing a parallel feeling in them. Thanks to the relativity of great inner as well as outer uniformity of human beings, it is actually possible to do this, though the form of acceptable to feeling is extraordinarily difficult to find as long as it is still mainly oriented to the fathomless store of primordial images. If, however, feeling is falsified by an egocentric attitude, it at once becomes unsympathetic, because it is then concerned mainly with the ego. It inevitably creates the impression of sentimental self-love, of trying to make itself interesting, and even morbid self-admiration. Just as the subjectivism consciousness of the introverted thinker, striving after abstraction to the nth degree, only succeeds in intensifying a thought process that is in itself empty, the intensification of egocentric feeling only leads to inane transports of feeling for their own sake. This is the mystical, ecstatic stage, which opens the way for the extroverted function that feeling has repressed. Just as introverted thinking is counterbalanced by a primitive feeling, to which objects attach themselves with magical force, introverted feeling is counterbalanced by primordial thinking, whose concretism and slavery to facts suppress all bounds. Feeling progressively emanates itself from the object, and creates for itself a freedom of action and conscience that is purely subjective, and may even renounce all traditional values. But so much the more does unconscious thinking fall victim to the power of objective reality, the introverted feeling type. It is principally among women that I have found the predominance of introverted feelings. Still waters run deep is very true of such women. They are mostly silent, inaccessible, hard to understand, and often they hide behind a childish or banal mask, and their temperament is inclined to melancholy. They neither shine nor reveal themselves, and they are mainly guided by their subjective feelings. Their true motives generally remain hidden. Their outward demeanor is harmonious, inconspicuous, giving an impression of pleasing repose or of sympathetic response, with no desire to affect others, to impress, influence, or change them in any way. If this outward aspect is more pronounced, it arouses a suspicion of indifference and coldness, which may actually turn into disregard for the comfort and well-being of others. One is distinctly aware, then, of the movement of feeling away from the object. With the normal type, however, this happens only when the influence of the object is too strong. The feeling of harmony, therefore, lasts only so long as the object goes its own moderate way and makes no attempt to cross the other's path. There is little effort to respond to the real emotion of the other person. They are more often damped down and rebuffed, or cooled off by negative value judgment. Although there is a constant readiness for peaceful and harmonious coexistence, strangers are shown no touch of amiability, no gleam of responsive warmth, but are met with apparent indifference, or repelling coldness. Often they are made to feel entirely superfluous. Faced with anything that might carry her away or arouse enthusiasm, this type observes a benevolent thought, though critical neutrality, coupled with a faint tint of superiority, that soon takes the wind out of the sails of a sensitive person. Any stormy emotion, however, will be struck down with murderous coldness unless it happens to catch the woman on her unconscious side, that is, unless it hits her feelings by arousing a primordial image. In that case, she simply feels paralyzed for the moment, and this, in due course, invariably produces an even more obstinate resistance that will hit the other person in his most vulnerable spot. As far as possible, the feeling relationship is kept to the safe middle path, all intemperate passions being resolutely tabooed. Expression of feeling is small, and the other person has a permanent sense of being undervalued once he becomes conscious of it. But this need not always be so, because very often he remains unconscious of the lack of feeling shown to him, in which case the unconscious demands of feeling will produce symptoms designed to compel action. Since this type appears rather cold and reserved, it might seem on a superficial view that such women have no feelings at all, but this would be quite wrong. The truth is their feelings are intense rather than extensive. They develop in depth. While an extensive feeling of sympathy can express itself in appropriate words and deeds, and thus quickly gets back to normal again, an intensive sympathy, being shut off from every means of expression, requires a passionate depth that comprises the whole world of misery and simply gets benumbed. It may perhaps break out in some extravagant form and lead to an astounding act of almost heroic character, quite unrelated either to the subject herself or to the object that provoked the outburst. To the outside world, or to the blind eyes of the extrovert, this intensive sympathy looks like coldness, because it does nothing visible, and an extroverted consciousness is unable to believe in invisible forces. Such a misunderstanding is a common occurrence in the life of this type, and is used as a weighty argument against the possibility of any deeper feeling relation with the object. But the real object of this feeling is only dimly divined by the normal type herself. It may express itself in a secret religiosity anxiously guarded from profane eyes, or in intimate poetic forms that are kept equally well hidden, but not without the secret ambition of displaying some kind of superiority over the other person by this means. Women often express a good deal of their feelings through their children, letting their passions flow secretly into them. Although this tendency to overpower or coerce the other person with her secret feelings rarely plays a disturbing role in the normal type, and never leads to serious attempt of this kind, some trace of it nevertheless seeps through into personal effect they have on him in the form of domineering influence, often difficult to define. It is sensed as a sort of shifting or oppressive feeling, which holds to everybody around her under a spell. It gives a woman of this type a mysterious power that may prove terribly fascinating to the extroverted man, for it touches his unconscious. This power comes from the deeply felt, unconscious images, but consciously she is apt to relate it to the ego, whereupon her influence becomes debased into a personal tyranny. Whenever the unconscious subject is identified with the ego, the mysterious power of intensive feeling turns into a banal and overweening desire to dominate, into vanity and despotic bossiness. This produces a type of woman notorious for her unscrupulous ambitions and mischievous cruelty. It is a change, however, that leads to this neurosis. So long as the ego feels subordinate to the unconscious subject, and the feeling is aware of something higher and mightier than the ego, the type is normal. Although the unconscious thinking is archaic, its reductive tendencies help to compensate the occasional fits of trying to exalt the ego into the subject. This should nevertheless happen as a result of complete suppression of the counterbalancing subliminal process. The unconscious thinking goes over into an open opposition and gets projected. The ego-centralized subject now comes to feel the power and importance of the devalued object. She begins consciously to feel what other people think. Naturally, other people are thinking all sorts of mean things, scheming evil, contriving plots, secret intrigues. In order to forestall them, she herself is obliged to start counter-intrigue, to suspect others and sound them out, weave counterplots. Beset by rumors, she must make frantic efforts to get her own back and be a top dog. Endless clandestine rivalries spring up, and these embittered struggles she will shrink from no baseness or meanness, and will even prostitute her virtues in order to play the trump card. Such a state of affairs must end in exhaustion. The form of neurosis is neurasthenic rather than hysterical, often with severe physical complications, such as anemia and its sequelae. Summary of the introverted rational types. Both foregoing types may be termed rational since they are grounded on the functions of rational judgment. Rational judgment is based not merely on objective but also on subjective data. The predominance of one or the other factor, however, as a result of psychic disposition, often existing from early youth, will give the judgment a corresponding bias. A judgment that is truly rational will appeal to the objective and subjective factor equally, and do justice to both. But that would be an ideal case and would presuppose an equal development of both extraversion and introversion. In practice, however, either movement excludes the other, and, so long as this dilemma remains, they cannot exist side by side, but at best successively. Under ordinary conditions, therefore, an ideal rationality is impossible. The rationality of a rational type always has a typical bias. Thus, the judgment of the introverted rational type is undoubtedly rational, only its orientated more by the subjective factor. This does not necessarily imply any logical bias, since the bias lies in the premise. The premise consists in all the predominance of the subjective factor prior to all conclusions and judgments. The superior value of the subjective as compared to the objective factor appears self-evident from the beginning. It is not a question of assigning this value, but, as we have said, of natural disposition existing before all rational valuation. Hence, to the introvert, rational judgment may have many nuances which differentiate it from that of the extrovert. To mention only the most general instances, the chain of reasoning that leads to the subjective factor seems to the introvert somewhat more rational than the one that leads to the object. This difference, though slight and practically unnoticeable in the individual case, builds up in the end to unbridgeable discrepancies, which are the more irritating the less one is aware of the minimal shift of standpoint occasioned by the psychological premise. A capital error regularly creeps in here, for instead of recognizing the difference in the premise, one tries to demonstrate a fallacy in the conclusion. This recognition is a difficult matter for every rational type, since it undermines the apparently absolute validity of his own principle and delivers him over to antithesis, which for him amounts to a catastrophe. The introvert is far more subject to misunderstanding than the extrovert, not so much because the extrovert is a more merciless or critical advisory than he himself might be, but because the style of the times which he himself initiates works against him. He finds himself in the minority, not in numerical relation to the extrovert, but in relation to the general Western view of the world as judged by his feelings. Insofar as he is a convinced participator in the general style, he undermines his own foundation. For the general style, acknowledging it as it does only the visible and tangible values, is opposed to his specific principle. Because of its invincibility, he is obliged to depreciate the objective factor and must force himself to join in the extroverted overvaluation of the object. He himself sets the subjective factor at too low a value, and his feelings of inferiority are his chastisement for his sin. Little wonder, therefore, that it is precisely in the present epoch, and particularly in those movements which are somewhat ahead of their time, that the subjective factor reveals itself in exaggerated, tasteless forms of expression bordering on caricature. I refer to the art of the present day. The undervaluation of his own principle makes the introverted egotistical and forces on him the psychology of the underdog. The more egotistical he becomes, the more it seems to him that the others who are apparently able, without qualms, to conform to the general style, are the oppressors against whom he must defend himself. He generally does not see that his chief error lies not in depending on the subjective factors with the same trust and devotion which the external relies on the object. His undervaluation of his own principle makes his leanings towards egoism unavoidable, and because of this he fully deserves the censure of the extrovert. If he remained true to his own principle, the charge of egoism would be altogether false, for his attitude would be justified by its effects in general, and the misunderstanding would be dissipated. Sensation. Sensation, which by its very nature is dependent on the object and on objective stimuli, undergoes considerable modification in the introverted attitude. It too has a subjective factor, for besides the sensed object there is a sensing subject, who adds his subjective disposition to the objective stimulus. In the introverted attitude, sensation is based predominantly on the subjective component of perception. What I mean by this is best illustrated by the work of art, which reproduce external objects. If, for instance, several painters were to paint the same landscape, each trying to reproduce it faithfully, each painting would be different from the others, not merely because of difference in ability, but chiefly because of different ways of seeing. Indeed, in some of the paintings there will be distinct psychic differences in mood, and the treatment of color and form. These qualities may betray the influence of the subjective factor. The subjective factor in sensations is essentially the same as in other functions that we have discussed. It is an unconscious disposition which alters the sense perception in its source, thus depriving it of the character of a purely objective influence. In this case, sensation is related primarily to the subject and not secondarily to the object. How extraordinarily strong the subjective factor can be is shown most clearly in art. Its predominance sometimes amounts to a complete suppression of the object's influence, and yet the sensation remains sensation, even though it becomes a perception of the subjective factor and the object has sunk to the level of mere stimulus. Introverted sensation is oriented accordingly. True sense perception certainly exists, but it always looks as though the objects did not penetrate into the subject in its own right, but as though the subject was seeing it quite differently, or saw quite other things than other people see. Actually, he perceives the same thing as everybody sees, only he does not stop at purely objective influence, but concerns himself with the subjective perception excited by the objective stimulus. Subject perception is markedly different from the objective. It is perceived in either what is perceived is either not found at all in the object, or is, at most, merely suggested by it. That is, although the perception can be similar to that of other men, it is not immediately derived from the objective behavior of things. It does not impress one as a mere product of consciousness. It is far too genuine for that. But it makes a definite psychic impression, because elements of a higher psychic order are discernible in it. This order, however, does not coincide with the contents of consciousness. It has to do with presuppositions or dispositions of the collective unconscious, with mythological images, with primordial possibilities of ideas. Subjective perception is characterized by the meaning that clings to it. It means more than the mere image of the object, though naturally only to one for whom the subjective factor means anything at all. To another, the reproduced subjective impression seems to suffer from the defect of not being sufficiently like the object, and therefore to have failed in its purpose. Introverted sensation apprehends the background of the psychic world rather than its surface. The decisive feeling is not the reality of the object, but the reality of the subjective factor, of the primordial images, which, in their totality, constitute a psychic mirror world. It is a mirror with a peculiar facility of reflecting and the existing contents of consciousness, not in their known and customary form, but, as it were, sub specie aeternitatis, somewhat as the million-year-old consciousness might see them. Such a consciousness would see the becoming and passing away of things simultaneously, with their momentary existence in the present. And not only that, it would also see that what was before their becoming and will be after their passing hence. Naturally, this is only a figure of speech, but one that I needed in order to illustrate in some way the peculiar nature of introverted sensation. We could say that introverted sensation transmits an image which does not so much reproduce the object as spread it over a patina of age-old subjective experiences and the shimmer of events still unborn. The bare sense impression develops in depth, reaching into the past and future, while extroverted sensation seizes on the momentary existence of things open to the light of day. The introverted sensation type. The predominance of introverted sensation produces a definite type which is characterized by certain peculiarities. It is an irrational type because it is oriented amid the flux of events not by rational judgment, but by simply what happens. Whereas the extroverted sensation type is guided by the intensity of objective influences, the introverted type is guided by the intensity of a subjective sensation excited by objective stimulus. Obviously, therefore, no proportional relation exists between the object and sensation, but one that is apparently quite unpredictable and arbitrary. What will make an impression and what will not can never be seen in advance, and from the outside. Did there exist an aptitude for expression in any way proportional to the intensity of his sensations, and the irrationality of this type would be extraordinary, striking. This is the case, for instance, when an individual is a creative artist. But since this is the exception, the introvert's characteristic difficulty in expressing himself also conceals his irrationality. On the contrary, he may be conspicuous for his calmness and passivity, or for his rational self-control. This peculiarity, which often leads a superficial judgment astray, is really due to his unrelatedness to objects. Normally, the object is not consciously devalued in the least, but its stimulus is removed from it and immediately replaced by a subjective reaction no longer related to the reality of the object. This naturally has the same effect as devaluation. Such a type can easily make one question why one should exist at all, why objects in general should have any justification for their existence, since everything essential still goes on happening without them. This doubt may be justified in extreme cases, but not in the normal, since the objective stimulus is absolutely necessary to sensation and merely produces something different from what the external sensation might lead one to expect. Seen from the outside, it looks as though the effect of the object did not penetrate into the subject at all. This impression is correct inasmuch as the subjective content does, in fact, intervene from the unconscious and intercept the effect of the object. The intervention may be so abrupt that the individual appears to be shielding himself directly from all objective influences. In more serious cases, such a protective defense actually does exist. Even with only a slight increase in the power of the unconscious, the subjective component of sensation becomes so alive that it almost completely obscures the influence of the object. If the object is a person, he feels completely devalued, while the subject has an illusory conception of reality, which in pathological cases goes so far that he is no longer able to distinguish between the real object and the subject of perception. Although so vital a distinction reaches the vanishing point only in near psychotic states, yet long before the subjective perception can influence thought, feeling, and action to an excessive degree, despite the fact that the object is clearly seen in all reality. When its influence does succeed in penetrating into the subject, because of its special intensity or because of its complete analogy with the unconscious image, even the normal type will be compelled to act in accordance with the unconscious world. Such an action has an illusory character, unrelated to objective reality, and is extremely disconcerting. It instantly reveals the reality alienating subjectivity of this type. But when the influence of the object does not break through completely, it is met with well-intentioned neutrality, disclosing little sympathy, yet constantly striving to soothe and adjust. This too low is raised a little, and do I is lowered. Enthusiasm is dampened, extravagance restrained, and anything out of the ordinary reduced to the right formula. All this in order to keep the influence of the object within necessary bounds. In this way the type becomes a menace of his environment, because his total innocuousness is not altogether above suspicion. In that case he can easily become victim of the aggressiveness and domineering of others. Such men allow themselves to be abused and take their revenge on the most unsuitable occasions, with redoubled obtuseness and stubbornness. If no capacity for artistic expression is present, all impressions sink into the depths and hold consciousness under a spell, so that it becomes impossible to master their fascination by giving them conscious expression. In general, this type can organize his impressions only in archaic ways, because thinking and feeling are relatively unconscious, and if conscious at all, have their disposal only in the most necessary, banal, and everyday means of expression. As conscious functions, they are wholly incapable of adequately reproducing his subjective perceptions. This type, therefore, is uncommonly inaccessible to objective understanding, and he usually fares no better in understanding himself. Above all, his development alienates him from the reality of the object, leaving him at the mercy of his subjective perceptions, which orient his consciousness to an archaic reality, though his lack of comparative judgment keeps him wholly unconscious of the fact. Actually, he lives in a mythological world, where men, animals, locomotives, houses, rivers, and mountains appear either as benevolent deities or malevolent demons. What they appear thus to him never enters his head, although this is just the effect they have on his judgments and actions. He judges and acts as though he had such powers to deal with, but this begins to strike him only when he discovers that his sensations are totally different from reality. If he has any aptitude for objective reason, he will sense this difference as morbid, but if he remains faithful to his irrationality, and is ready to grant his sensations reality value, the objective world will appear as mere make-believe and a comedy. Only in extreme cases, however, is this dilemma reached. As a rule, he resigns himself to his isolation and the banality of the world, which he unconsciously makes archaic. His unconscious is distinguished chiefly by the repression of intuition, which consequently acquires an extroverted and archaic character. Whereas true extroverted intuition is possessed of a singular resourcefulness, a good nose for objective real possibilities. This archaicized intuition has an amazing flair for all the ambiguous, shadowy, sordid, dangerous possibilities lurking in the background. The real unconscious intentions of the objective mean nothing to it. Instead, it sniffs out every conceivable archaic motive underlying such an intention. It therefore has a dangerous and destructive quality that contrasts glaringly with the well-meaning innocuousness of the conscious attitude. So long as the individual does not hold too aloof from the subject, his unconscious intuition has a salutary, compensating effect rather than a fantastic, over-credulous attitude of consciousness. But as soon as the unconscious becomes antagonistic, the archaic intuitions come to the surface and exert their pernicious influence, forcing themselves on the individual and producing compulsive ideas of the most perverse kind. The result is usually a compulsive neurosis, in which the hysterical features are masked by symptoms of exhaustion. Intuition. Introverted intuition is directed to the inner object, a term that might justly be applied to the contents of the unconscious. The relation of inner objects to consciousness is entirely analogous to that of outer objects, though their reality is not physical but psychic. They appear to intuitive perception as subjective images of things which, though not to be met with in the outside world, constitute the contents of the unconscious, and of the collective unconscious in particular. These contents per se are naturally not accessible to experience, a quality they have in common with external objects. For just as external objects correspond only relatively to our perception of them, so the phenomenal forms of the inner objects are also relative, products of their, to us, inaccessible essence and of the peculiar nature of the intuitive function. Like sensation, intuition has its subjective factor. which is suppressed as much as possible in the extroverted attitude, but is the decisive factor in the intuition of the introvert. Although his intuition may be stimulated by external objects, it does not concern itself with external possibilities, but with the external object has released within him. Whereas introverted sensation is mainly restricted to the perception, via the unconscious, of the phenomenon of the innervation and is arrested there, introverted intuition suppresses the sight of the subjective factor and perceives the image that causes the innervation. Supposing, for instance, a man is overtaken by an attack of psychotic vertigo. Sensation is arrested by the peculiar nature of this disturbance of innervation, perceiving all its qualities, its intensity, its course, how it arose, and how it passed, but not advancing beyond that to its content, to the thing that caused the disturbance. Intuition, on the other hand, receives from sensation only the impetus to its own immediate activity. It peers behind the scenes, quickly perceiving the inner image that gives rise to this particular form of expression, the attack of vertigo. It sees the image of a tottering man pierced through the heart by an arrow. This image fascinates the intuitive activity. It is arrested by it, and seeks to explore every detail of it. It holds fast to the vision, observing with the liveliest interest how the picture changes, unfolds, and finally fades. In this way, introverted intuition perceives all the background processes of consciousness with almost the same distinctiveness as the extroverted sensation registers external objects. For intuition, therefore, unconscious images acquire the dignity of things. But because intuition excludes the cooperation of sensation, it obtains little or no knowledge of the disturbance of innervation or of the physical effects produced by the unconscious images. The images appear as though detached from the subject, as though existing in themselves without any relation to him. Consequently, in the above-mentioned example, the introverted intuitive, if attacked by vertigo, would never imagine that the image he perceived may in some way refer to himself. To a judging type, this naturally seems almost inconceivable, but it is nonetheless a fact which I have often come across in my dealings with intuitives. The remarkable indifference of the extroverted intuitive to external objects is shared by the introverted intuitive in relation to inner objects. Just as the extroverted intuitive is continually scenting out new possibilities, which he pursues with equal unconcern for his own welfare and that of others, pressing on quite heedless of human considerations and tearing down what just has been built in his everlasting search for change, so the introverted intuitive moves from image to image, chasing after every possibility in the teeming womb of the unconscious, without establishing any connection between them and himself. Just as the world of appearances can never become a moral problem for the man who merely senses it, the world of inner images is never a moral problem for the intuitive. For both of them it is an aesthetic problem, a matter of perception, a sensation. Because of this, the introverted intuitive has little consciousness of his own bodily existence or its effects on others. The extrovert would say, reality does not exist for him. He gives himself up to fruitless fantasies. The perception of the images of the unconscious, produced in such inexhaustible abundance by the creative energy of life, is of course fruitless from the standpoint of immediate utility. But since these images represent possible views of the world, which may give life to a new potential, this function, which to the outside world is the strangest of all, is as indisputable to the total psychic economy as is the corresponding human type to the psychic life of people. Had this type not existed, there would be no prophets in Israel. Introverted intuition apprehends the images arising from them a priori, inherited foundations of the unconscious. These archetypes, whose innermost nature is inaccessible to experience, are the precipitate of the psychic functioning of the whole ancestral line. The accumulated experiences of organic life in general, a million times repeated and condensed into types. In these archetypes, therefore, all experiences are represented which have happened on this planet since primeval time. The more frequent and more intense they were, the more clearly focused they become in the archetype. The archetype would thus be, to borrow from Kant, the nominal of the image which intuition perceived and, in perceiving, creates. Since the unconscious is not just something that lies there like a psychic caput mortuum, but coexists with us and is constantly undergoing transformations, which are inwardly connected with the general run of events, introverted intuition, through its perception of those inner processes, can supply certain data which may be of the utmost importance for understanding what is going on in the world. It can even foresee new possibilities in more or less clear outline, as well as events which later actually do happen. Its prophetic foresight is explained by its relation to the archetypes, which represent the laws governing the course of all experienceable things. The introverted intuitive type. The peculiar nature of introverted intention, if it gains the ascendancy, produces a peculiar type of man, the mystical dreamer and seer on the one hand, the artist and crank on the other. The artist might be regarded as the normal representative of this type, which tends to confine itself to the perceptive character of intuition. As a rule, the intuitive stops at perception. Perception is her main problem, and, in the case of a creative artist, the shaping of her perception. But the crank is content with a visionary image by which she herself is shaped and determined. Naturally, the intensification of intuition often results in an extraordinary aloofness of the individual from tangible reality. She may even become a complete enigma in her immediate circle. If she is an artist, she reveals strange, far-off things in her art, shimmering in all colors, at once pretentious and banal, beautiful and grotesque, sublime and whimsical. If not an artist, she is frequently a misunderstood genius, a great person gone wrong, a sort of wise simpleton, a figure for psychological novels. Although the intuitive type has less inclination to make a moral problem of perception, since the strengthening of the judging function is required for this, only a slight differentiation of judgment is sufficient to shift intuitive perception from the purely aesthetic into the moral sphere. A variety of this type is thus produced, which differs essentially from the aesthetic, although it is nonetheless characteristic of the introverted intuitive. The moral problem arises when the intuitive tries to relate herself to her vision, when she is no longer satisfied with mere perception and its aesthetic configuration and evaluation, when she confronts the question, what does this mean for me or for the world? What emerges from this vision in the way of a duty or a task for me or the world? The pure intuitive who represses her judgment, and whose judgment is held in thrall by her perceptive faculties, never faces this question squarely, since her only problem is the know-how of perception. She finds the moral problem unintelligible and even absurd, as far as possible forbids her thoughts to dwell on this disconcerting vision. It is different with the morally oriented intuitive. She reflects on the meaning of her vision, and is less concerned with developing its aesthetic possibilities than with the moral effects that emerge from its intrinsic significance. Her judgment allows her to discern, though often only darkly, that she, as a person and a whole human being, is somehow involved in her vision, that it is not just an object to be perceived, but wants to participate in the life of the subject. Through this realization, she feels bound to transform her vision into her own life. But since she tends to rely most predominantly on her vision, her moral efforts become one-sided. She makes herself and her life symbolic, adapted, it is true, to the inner and eternal meaning of events, but unadapted to present-day reality. She thus deprives herself of any influence upon it, because she remains uncomprehended. Her language is not the one currently spoken. It has become too subjective. Her arguments lack the convincing power of reason. She can only profess or proclaim. She is the voice of one crying into the wilderness. What the introverted intuitive represses most of all is the sensation of the object, and this colors her whole consciousness, her whole unconsciousness. It gives rise to a compensatory extroverted sensation function of an archaic nature. The unconscious personality can best be described as an extroverted sensation type of rather low and primitive order. Instinctuality and intemperance are the hallmarks of the sensation, combined with an extraordinary dependence on sense impression. This compensates the rarefied air of the individual's conscious attitude. giving it a certain weight so that complete sublimation is present. But if, through a forced exaggeration of the conscious attitude, there should be a complete subordination to inner perceptions, the unconscious goes over to the opposition, gives rise to compulsive sensations whose excessive dependence on the object directly contradicts the conscious attitude. This form of neurosis is a compulsion neurosis with hypochondriacal symptoms, hypersensitivity of the sense organs, and compulsive ties to particular persons or objects. Summary of the introverted irrational types. The two types just described are almost inaccessible to judgment from outside. Being introverted and having in consequence little capacity or desire for expression, they offer a fragile handle in this respect. As their main activity is directed inwards, nothing is outwardly visible but reserve, secretiveness, lack of sympathy, uncertainty, and an apparently groundless embarrassment. When anything does come to the surface, it is generally an indirect manifestation of the inferior and relatively unconscious functions. Such manifestations naturally arouse all the current prejudices against this type. Accordingly, they are mostly underestimated, or at least misunderstood. To the extent they do not understand themselves, because they very largely lack judgment, they are also powerless to understand why they are so constantly underestimated by the public. They cannot see that their efforts to be forthcoming are, as a matter of fact, an inferior character. Their vision is enthralled by the richness of subjective events. What is going on inside them is so captivating and of such inexhaustible charm that they simply do not notice that the little they do manage to communicate contains hardly anything of what they themselves have experienced. The fragmentary and episodic character of their communications makes too great a demand on the understanding and goodwill of those around them. Also, their communications are without personal warmth and alone carries the power of conviction. On the contrary, these types have very often a harsh, repelling manner, though of this they are quite unaware and did not intend it. We shall form a fairer judgment of such people and show them greater forbearance when we begin to realize how hard it is to translate into intelligible language what is perceived within. Yet, this forbearance must not go on so far as to exempt them altogether from the need to communicate. This would only do to them the greatest harm. Fate itself prepares them, perhaps more than other men, overwhelming external difficulties which have a sombering effect on those intoxicated by their inner vision. Often it is only an intense personal need that can wring them from their human confession. That can wring from them a human confession. From an extroverted and rationalistic standpoint, these types are indeed the most useless of men. But viewed from a higher standpoint, they are living evidence that this rich and varied world with its overflowing and intoxicating life is not purely external, but also exists within. These types are admittedly one-sided specimens of nature, but they are object lessons for the men who refuse to be blinded by the intellectual fashion of the day. In their own way, they are educators and promoters of culture. Their life teaches more than their words. From their lives, and not least from their greatest fault, their inability to communicate, we may understand one of the greatest errors of our civilization, that is, the superstitious belief in verbal statements, the boundless overestimation of instruction by means of words and methods. A child certainly allows himself to be impressed by the grandest talk of his parents, but do they really imagine he is educated by it? Actually, it is his parents' lives that educate the child. What they add by word and gesture at best serve only to confuse him. The same holds good for the teacher. But we have such a belief in method that, if only the method be good, the practice of it seems to sanctify the teacher. An inferior man is never a good teacher, but he can conceal his pernicious inferiority, which secretly poisons a pupil, behind an excellent method or an equally brilliant gift of gab. Naturally, the pupil of riper years desires nothing better than the knowledge of useful methods, because he is already defeated by the general attitude, which believes in an all-conquering method. He has learned that the emptiest head, correctly parroting a method, is the best pupil. His whole environment is an optical demonstration of the success and that all success and happiness are outside, and that the only right method is needed to attain heaven, the haven of one's desire. Or does perchance the life of his religious instructor demonstrate the happiness which radiates from the treasure of the inner vision? The irrational introverted types are certainly no teachers of a more perfect harmony. They lack reason and the ethics of reason. but their lives teach the other possibility, the interior life which is so painfully wanting in our civilization. D. The principal and auxiliary functions. In the foregoing descriptions, I have no desire to give my readers the impression that these types occur at all frequently in such pure form in actual life. They are, as it were, only Galtonesque family portraits, which single out the common and therefore typical features, stressing them disproportionately, while the individual features are just as disproportionately effaced. Closer investigation shows with great regularity that, besides the most differentiated function, another, less differentiated function of secondary importance is invariably present in the consciousness and exerts a co-determining influence. To recapitulate for the sake of clarity, the products of all functions can be conscious, but we speak of consciousness of a function only when its use is under the control and will, and at the same time its governing principle is the decisive one for the orientation of consciousness. This is true when, for instance, thinking is not a mere afterthought or rumination, and when its conclusions possess an absolute validity, so that the logical result holds good both as a motive and as a guarantee of practical action, without the backing of any further evidence. This absolute sovereignty always belongs empirically to one function alone, and can belong only to one function, because the equally independent intervention of another function would necessarily produce a different orientation, which, particularly at least, would contradict the first. But since it is a vital condition for the conscious process of adaptation always to have clear and unambiguous aims, the presence of a second function of equal power is naturally ruled out. This other function, therefore, can have only a secondary importance, and has been found to be the case in practice. Its secondary importance is due to the fact that it is not, like the primary function, valid in its own right as an absolutely reliable and decisive factor, but comes into play more as an auxiliary or complementary function. Naturally, only those functions can appear as auxiliary whose nature is not opposed to the dominant function. For instance, feeling can never act as a second function alongside thinking, because it is by its very nature too strongly opposed to thinking. Thinking, if it is to be real thinking and true to its own principle, must rigorously exclude feeling. This, of course, does not do away with the fact that there are individuals whose thinking and feeling are on the same level, both being of equal motive power for consciousness, but in these cases there is also no question of a differentiated type, but merely of a relatively undeveloped thinking and feeling. The uniformly conscious or uniformly unconscious state of the function is, therefore, the mark of a primitive mentality. Experience shows that the secondary function is always one whose nature is different from, although not antagonistic to, the primary function. Thus thinking as a primary function can readily pair with intuition as an auxiliary, or indeed equally with sensation, but, as already observed, never with feeling. Neither intuition nor sensation is antagonistic to thinking. They need not be absolutely excluded, for they are not of a nature equal and opposite to thinking, as feeling is, which, as a judging function, successfully competes with thinking, but are functions of perception, affording welcome assistance to thought. But as soon as they reach the same level of differentiation as thinking, they would bring about a change of attitude, which would contradict the whole trend of thinking. They would change the judging attitude into perceiving one, whereupon the principle of rationality indispensable to thought would be suppressed in favor of the irrationality of perception. Hence the auxiliary function is possible and useful only in so far as it serves the dominant function, without making any claim to the authority of its own principle. For all the types met with in practice, the rule holds good that beside the conscious primary function, there is a relatively unconscious auxiliary function, which is in every respect different from the nature of the primary function. The resulting combinations present the familiar picture of, for instance, practical thinking allied with sensation, speculative thinking forging ahead with intuition, artistic intuition selecting and presenting its images with the help of feeling values, philosophical intuition systematizing its vision into a comprehensible thought by means of a powerful intellect, and so on. The unconscious function likewise group themselves in patterns correlated with the conscious ones. Thus, the correlatives of conscious practical thinking may be unconscious intuitive feeling attitude, with feelings under a stronger inhibition than intuition. These peculiarities are of interest only for one who is concerned with the practical treatment of such cases, but it is important that he should know about them. I have frequently observed how an analyst, confronted with a terrified thinking type, for instance, will do his utmost to develop the feeling function directly of the unconscious. Such an attempt is foredoomed to failure because it involves too great a violation of the conscious standpoint. Should the violation nevertheless be successful, a really compulsive dependence of the patient on the analyst ensues, a transference that can only be brutally terminated, because having been left without a standpoint, the patient has to make his standpoint the analyst. But the approach to the unconscious and to the most repressed function is disclosed, as it were, of its own accord, and with adequate protection of the conscious standpoint, when the way of the development proceeds via the auxiliary function, in the case of rational type via one of the irrational functions. This gives the patient a broader view of which is happening and of what is possible, so that his consciousness is sufficiently protected against the inroads of the unconscious. Conversely, in order to cushion the impact of the unconscious, an irrational type needs a stronger development of the rational auxiliary function present in consciousness. The unconscious functions exist in an archaic animal state. Hence their symbolic appearance in dreams and fantasies is usually represented as the battle or encounter between two animals or monsters.